My hands shook as I gripped the cold steel wrench. The wind howled through the broken city, but it could not drown out that sound. The deep roar of a V8 engine, tires crushing gravel. The spare tire I just traded for 3 cans of peaches belonged to a warlord. And now, he was here. A tall shadow stepped out of the black car, glowing amber eyes locked onto me in the dark. I took a single step back, but the realization hit like a punch to the gut. I stole from Alpha Ronin, and he did not come to take his tire back. Chapter 1. The Missing Tire. The dust barons offered zero mercy. A punishing wind kicked up dirt, scratching against the rusted frame of my 1983 Ford Ranger pickup. I parked behind a crumbling concrete wall, killing the ignition. The engine let out a harsh, dying sputter. The timing belt squealed a high-pitched warning before fading into the desolate quiet. Every person who promises protection eventually leaves, I reminded myself, pulling a wooden match from my pocket and wedging the stick between my teeth. A wrench never lies. I wore a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit over a faded thermal shirt, paired with duct-taped combat boots. The outfit carried a faint, enduring scent of motor oil and old rust. My dark hair blew across my face, the ends stinging my cheeks. I secured the strap of my red canvas backpack, testing the weight against my shoulders. The Iron Claw compound loomed a half-mile away, surrounded by heavy metal fencing. The local pack hoarded the best salvage in the territory. Stealing from them qualified as an act of pure insanity. I needed one specific piece of rubber, and saving 10,000 salvage credits for a green zone border pass required extreme risks. I crept through the shadows, keeping my boots light against the gravel. Finding a jagged gap in the rusted chain-link fence, I squeezed my petite frame through the metal barrier. I slipped into the warlord's private motor pool. Sitting in the center of the garage was a black 1970 Dodge Charger. The vehicle looked terrifying, stripped of excess weight, and coated in matte paint. A brand-new spare tire sat bolted to the rear trunk rack. I unzipped my backpack and pulled out a steel 4-way lug wrench. Working with practiced speed, I jammed the socket over the first bolt. The metal felt like a block of ice against my leather work gloves. I braced my boots against the bumper, putting my entire body weight into the turn. My muscles strained. The seized lug nut popped loose with a sharp crack. I moved to the next bolt, repeating the brutal process. 3 minutes passed. The heavy spare tire hit the dirt with a thud. Rolling the stolen prize through the wasteland took an hour of exhausting labor. I hauled the rubber back to my Ford Ranger, shoved the prize into the rust-orange truck bed, and sped away from the Iron Claw camp before the sun crested the horizon. By noon, the scrap outpost bustled with desperate traders. The makeshift market operated out of a collapsed highway overpass, buzzing with the haggling shouts of drifters. Scavengers traded brass casings for purified water and stripped copper wire for stale bread. I rolled the stolen Charger tire through the crowd, keeping my head down. A pair of merchants stood near a burn barrel, exchanging hushed whispers.
Jax took another convoy near the salt flats yesterday,
The first trader muttered, holding his hands over the flames. The second merchant shuddered, pulling his frayed collar tight against his neck.
They found the guards nailed to the road signs. The Sandskull rogues took the cargo and burned the wagons to ash. Jax leaves 0 survivors. He claims history belongs to the unbroken.
The villainous name sent a cold spike of dread down my spine. The feral leader of the Sandskull rogues turned the outer highways into a slaughterhouse. He embodied the worst horrors of the Wasteland. I pushed the grim rumors aside and rolled the tire up to the quartermaster's counter. The man behind the wood went by Boz. He possessed a scarred face and a stingy reputation. 3 cans of syrupy peaches, I demanded, slapping my grease-stained palms against the counter. No dents, no expired labels. Boz eyed the unblemished rubber. His jaw dropped.
2 cans. That tread is clean, but peaches are a luxury.
That is an all-terrain puncture-proof radial, I countered, pointing my finger at the tread. It has 0 miles on the rubber. It came straight off a warlord's private rack. 3 cans, Boz, or I take it to the southern traders. Without a word of protest, he retreated into his supply cage, retrieved 3 shiny cans of fruit, and slid them across the counter. Victory tasted sweet. I shoved 2 cans deep into my backpack. Taking the third, I popped the metal tab, peeled back the lid, and speared a bright orange peach slice with the tip of my pocket knife. Sugar flooded my tongue, chasing away the bitter taste of the desert dust. A chilling silence crashed over the crowded outpost. The chaotic haggling ground to a halt. The surrounding drifters scrambled backward, pressing their bodies against the concrete walls. A sharp, dominant blend of campfire smoke and crushed pine invaded my senses. Footsteps thundered against the cracked asphalt. Turning around, I found a nightmare blocking the exit. Alpha Ronan, the undefeated ruler of the Dust Barons, stood a towering 6 feet and 5 inches tall. Silver-scarred battle marks crisscrossed his exposed skin. He wore a weathered leather duster over a dark gray tank top and scuffed steel-toed boots. A dark beard framed his clenched jaw. His piercing amber gaze locked onto my face. Blistering thermal energy radiated from his broad chest, pushing the freezing desert chill away. He tracked the stolen rubber to the outpost.
Kneel.
The command erupted from his throat. The alpha voice hit the air like a kinetic blast. Every rogue wolf and scavenger in the outpost dropped to the dirt, covering their heads in terror. The biological compulsion demanded unquestioning submission from the shifting kind. I stood straight up, blinking at the warlord. Human biology lacked the internal wiring to register shifter dominance. Tucking the matchstick behind my ear, I took another bite of my fruit. "You need to use your inside voice," I scolded, gesturing toward the cowering traders with my dripping knife. "People are trying to conduct business. It is rude to yell in a marketplace." Ronan froze. The feral rage twisting his scarred features melted into unfiltered bewilderment. He looked at the groveling wolves on the floor, then back to the petite mechanic eating fruit.
You stole the spare tire off my charger.
Ronan rumbled, his voice dropping into a dangerous threat.
You defaced Ironclaw property. Submit to your alpha.
"I am a human, which means you are not my alpha," I corrected, fishing another syrupy slice out of the tin. "And your tire was just sitting there collecting dust. I put it into the local economy. It was a civic service." The warlord stepped forward, his heavy boots closing the distance. He loomed over me, trying to comprehend the audacity of his prey.
You confessed to the theft.
Ronan asked, his tone tight. "I confess to initiating a trade," I argued, holding my ground. "You possess a fortified compound full of luxury salvage. I possess an empty stomach. The transfer of wealth makes logical sense."
You breached my perimeter.
He countered, pointing a calloused finger at my nose.
You took a wrench to my vehicle. That is an act of war in the Dust Barons.
"It was 4 lug nuts," I dismissed, waving my hand. "A real act of war involves taking the catalytic converter. I left your engine block intact. You should thank me for my restraint." Ronan stared at me. His heavy chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm.
The beast inside his mind roared in sheer disbelief. A scavenger stole from an apex predator and demanded gratitude.
I do not offer gratitude to thieves.
Ronan stated. "I am a specialist, not a thief," I replied. "A thief takes things for fun. A specialist takes things to survive."
And what happens when the specialist angers a warlord?
He challenged, leaning closer. The heat pouring off his skin felt like an open oven door. Sighing, I held out the tin can toward his broad chest. "Do you want a peach?" I asked, offering a truce. "You look like you have low blood sugar. It makes people cranky." Chapter 2, The Freight Load. The offer of canned fruit hung in the freezing air of the scrap outpost. Alpha Ronan stared down at the syrupy peach slice balanced on the end of my knife. The fierce ruler of the Ironclaw pack fought brutal turf wars and executed rival rogues. Nobody offered him snacks. He demanded blood, and I offered him a sugary carbohydrate. A low, vibrating rumble started deep within his broad chest. The noise sounded like the suppressed, purring approval of a wild beast.
You possess zero fear.
Ronan stated, his gravelly voice tight. "I have excellent priorities," I countered, rolling the unlit pine over my tongue. "I just acquired 3 days' worth of high-calorie rations. Your priorities involve screaming at people in public. Take the peach, or move out of my way. I have a truck to catch." Dropping the tin can into my backpack, I zipped the fabric shut and turned to walk past him. The warlord did not yield the exit. Before I could take a second step, a large, calloused hand clamped around my waist. The scalding warmth of his palm burned through my thick jumpsuit. Lifting me off the asphalt with zero effort, Ronan hoisted my body over his broad shoulder. "Put me down," I shouted, the breath rushing out of my lungs as my stomach hit his solid muscle.
You sold my property.
Ronan answered, marching out of the concrete outpost.
You owe the pack a debt. Looks like I am carrying you back to camp to work it off.
"I do not work for free," I yelled, kicking my combat boots against his chest. "Put me down."
You work to clear your debt.
He corrected, his stride unwavering. Panic spiked in my chest. Digging into the open pocket of the red canvas backpack crushed against my ribs, my fingers found the cold grip of my steel lug wrench. I yanked the weapon free, raising the metal high above my head. Striking downward, I slammed the wrench hard against the center of his back. The impact echoed with a dull, hollow thud. Ronan did not stumble. He did not break his stride. The accelerated healing of his shifter biology absorbed the blow on contact.
The metal feels cold.
He noted, his tone unbothered.
Try aiming higher next time. My shoulders carry more tension.
"You are a kidnapping menace," I yelled, striking him a second time near his shoulder blade. The wrench bounced off his corded muscle.
And you are a terrible combatant.
Ronan replied.
Drop the tool before you drop it on your own foot.
"I will dismantle your car piece by piece," I threatened.
You will fix my generators.
He countered. We reached the edge of the market perimeter where his custom-built black 1970 Dodge Charger sat idling. The thick armor plating gleamed under the gray sky. Opening the passenger door, he dumped me onto the dark leather bench seat.
Stay,
he commanded, pointing a thick finger at my nose. Slamming the door shut, he engaged the manual exterior deadbolts with a loud metallic clack. The heavy locks trapped me inside the cabin. Gripping the interior handle, I yanked the lever backward. The mechanism refused to budge. The reinforced windows lacked rolling cranks. I assessed my surroundings. I ran my gloved hands along the interior door panels. The steel felt thicker than standard post-war salvage. I knocked my knuckles against the window. The glass did not rattle. I traced the reinforcement welds around the door frames, noticing the flawless, industrial precision of the joints. This is pre-war military bunker plating, I realized, tracing a hidden serial number stamped into the metal. You cannot melt this kind of steel in a standard scrap forge. Where did a Wasteland gang get military drop steel? Ronan climbed into the driver's seat. The blistering heat radiating from his skin fought the bitter chill trapped in the cabin. "Unlock this door," I demanded, clutching my red backpack to my chest. "I have my own vehicle. My Ford Ranger is parked behind the concrete wall."
Your rust bucket remains at the outpost.
He dismissed, shifting the heavy transmission into gear.
You belong to the Iron Claw Pack now.
"I belong to myself," I argued, pressing my boot against the dashboard. "I spent 5 years saving 10,000 salvage credits for a green zone pass. I am not throwing my life away to fix your broken camp."
The Green Zone is a myth, built to give weak people false hope.
Ronan stated, his voice flat.
You stay in the Barrens. You stay under my protection.
"I do not want your protection," I shot back, a bitter edge entering my tone. "Protection implies trust. Trust gets people killed." I pulled a fresh wooden match from my box, struck the head against the metal doorframe, and blew the tiny flame out before sliding the burnt pine between my teeth. "I charge 50 salvage credits an hour for mechanical repairs," I stated, tasting the sulfur tip. "And I require hazard pay if I have to listen to your driving."
I do not pay hazard pay to thieves.
He rumbled. "Then I will unionize your motor pool and organize a strike," I threatened. Ronan let out a low chuckle. He steered the heavy Charger away from the outpost, the thick tires kicking up a dense cloud of dust. Chapter 3. The Space Heater. The drive back to the Iron Claw camp stretched across miles of desolate terrain. The armored Dodge Charger devoured the cracked asphalt of the old world. Outside the reinforced windows, the dust barrens looked like a graveyard of rust and dead timber. The setting sun dipped below the jagged horizon, dragging the weak daylight down with it. Darkness brought the true horror of the wasteland. The temperature plummeted to sub-zero torture. Frost began to spiderweb across the edges of the windshield. Sitting on the far edge of the leather bench seat, I pulled my knees to my chest. I tucked my gloved hands under my armpits, trying to trap my fading body heat. The cold sliced through my thermal shirt, turning my joints stiff and uncoordinated. My teeth chattered, echoing with a rhythmic, clicking sound over the roar of the diesel engine. "Turn on the heater," I demanded, my breath pluming in a white cloud.
The blower motor broke 3 months ago. A rogue ambush damaged the intake valve. The cabin lacks climate control.
"You drive a fortified death machine and you cannot fix a simple fan?" I scoffed, shivering. What kind of warlord freezes in his own truck?
Wolves do not freeze.
He answered, his tone carrying a hint of smug superiority. Glancing across the dark cabin, I noticed the truth in his words. The Alpha remained exposed to the freezing air, but he did not shiver. A fierce, relentless thermal energy poured from his broad frame. His shifter biology fueled an internal furnace. Hypothermia kills fast, so I might as well die warm. Abandoning all sense of personal space, I uncurled my legs. I scooted across the smooth leather bench seat, sliding directly into the center of the cab. Closing the gap, I pressed my left side flush against his right arm. The intense physical heat pouring from his bicep soaked through my clothes, offering glorious relief to my frozen ribs. Ronan stiffened. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, the leather groaning under his grip.
The beast wants to lock her in a cage to keep her safe.
Ronan thought, fighting his own instincts.
But a caged bird forgets how to fly.
What are you doing?
He asked, his gravelly voice dropping an octave. "You ruined my kidnapping experience by lacking proper hospitality," I complained, keeping my matchstick clamped between my teeth. "I am utilizing local resources to prevent frostbite. Stop complaining and radiate more heat." The warlord let out a sharp, jagged gasp. He did not push me away. He did not shout an alpha command to force my retreat. He locked his jaw. The fierce possessiveness running through his veins latched onto the physical contact.
You lack boundaries.
Ronan muttered. "You threw me over your shoulder like a sack of potatoes," I fired back. "You lost the right to demand personal space."
You stole my spare tire.
He reminded me. "And you stole my entire person," I argued. "I think you came out ahead in the trade."
A spare tire does not talk back.
Ronan noted. "A spare tire does not know how to fix a failing intake valve either," I pointed out. "I can have this cabin blowing hot air in 20 minutes if you give me a wrench and a roll of copper wire."
My mechanics handle the repairs.
He said. "Your mechanics let you freeze for 3 months," I corrected. "They are incompetent." The heavy charger rumbled through a narrow canyon pass. The steep rock walls shielded the vehicle from the howling desert wind. In the quiet of the cabin, the tension shifted from hostile to a slow, burning quiet. I leaned my head against his shoulder. The steady rhythm of the engine and the blistering warmth of his skin acted as a comforting blanket. My eyelids grew heavy. "He runs a brutal gang, yet he acts like a premium space heater," I mused, letting the exhaustion win. I fell asleep against his arm. Ronan did not wake me. He endured the cramped, awkward angle of the drive, refusing to move a single muscle that might disturb my rest. For a ruthless killer, he made a fantastic pillow.
The camp sits just beyond the ridge.
Ronan announced much later. He glanced down at my face.
You will repair the perimeter generators. In exchange, I will ensure you do not freeze.
I blinked my eyes open, sitting up and rubbing my stiff neck. I require 2 hot meals a day and a guaranteed supply of peaches. A low chuckle vibrated deep in his chest. He steered the armored truck up the final incline, cresting the ridge to reveal the sprawling, fortified iron walls of the Iron Claw compound. Chapter 4. Compound Life. The heavy iron gates of the Iron Claw compound groaned open, welcoming the black Dodge Charger into the fortified courtyard. Scrap metal barricades and rusted watchtowers formed a thick ring of defense against the brutal dust barons. Ronan navigated the vehicle through the bustling camp. parking near a reinforced concrete building at the center of the territory. Killing the engine, the warlord unlatched the passenger door. The freezing desert wind rushed back into the cabin, stealing the radiant heat I hoarded during the long drive. A vehicle offers shelter, but it requires fuel, I calculated, grabbing the straps of my red canvas backpack. A permanent garage offers a future. I slid off the leather seat and hit the dirt. Several rugged wolves paused their tasks to stare at the new arrival. They expected their leader to return with high-tier salvage or a captive enemy rogue. Bringing a petite, grease-stained human into the inner sanctum defied pack logic. Ronan pointed a calloused finger toward a sprawling, open-air structure on the western wall.
Wait in the motor pool. Do not breach the perimeter.
He marched toward the command center without checking to see if I obeyed. I hoisted my bag over my shoulders and walked toward the designated garage. The motor pool sat in a state of chaotic ruin. Gutted sedans and rusted engine blocks cluttered the cracked concrete floor. Spark plugs lay scattered among discarded food tins. Finding a usable part in this graveyard required a miracle. A young boy with dirt-smudged cheeks sat on a stack of bald tires in the corner. He looked about 10 years old, watching the adults work with wide, vigilant eyes. An older man with a gray, greasy beard stood near a sputtering diesel generator. He held a roll of silver duct tape, preparing to slap the adhesive over a cracked intake valve. The machine shook, coughing thick black smoke into the air. "Stop!" I yelled, dropping my backpack onto a metal workbench. "Do not put tape on that valve." The old mechanic turned around, glaring at my interruption.
I am Old Man Griff. I run the repairs for this pack. Who are you to tell me how to patch a leak?
"I am the person saving you from blowing off your own eyebrows," I answered, walking straight up to the generator. I leaned close to the metal casing. Closing my eyes, I listened to the uneven, jagged rhythm of the engine block. The vibrations told a clear story. "Your patch job is useless," I diagnosed, stepping back from the smoke. "Cylinder 3 is not firing. The fuel line is choking on sediment." Griff let out a harsh scoff, crossing his arms over his chest.
You cannot diagnose a dead cylinder by ear, girl. The seal is just loose.
I ignored his pride. I reached past him, grabbed a heavy steel wrench from his open toolbox, and tapped the side of the third fuel injector with the precise amount of force required to dislodge a clog. The engine sputtered, let out a loud pop, and stabilized into a smooth, even hum. The surrounding mechanics fell silent. Griff stared at the running generator, his mouth hanging open. "I know bad fuel by smell," I stated, handing the wrench back to the stunned old man. "The exhaust carries a sour sulfur note. Flush the main tank before sunset, or this entire grid goes dark." Turning my back on the humiliated mechanic, I focused my attention on the young boy sitting on the tires. "What is your name, kid?" I asked, pulling a fresh match from my pocket and biting the unlit sulfur tip.
Liam,
he answered, jumping down from the rubber stack. "Liam, hand me that 3/4-inch socket," I instructed, pointing to a scattered pile of tools near his boots. Liam grabbed the heavy steel socket and walked toward me. "No," I corrected, stepping back. "In a real garage, you do not walk. You throw. Toss it." Liam hesitated. He looked at the heavy metal in his hand, then back at my face. He lobbed the socket through the air in a clumsy arc. I kept my eyes fixed on the boy, reaching my left hand out and catching the flying tool without looking at it. "That is a no-look tool toss," I explained, tossing the socket back to him. "It requires timing and trust. You learn to throw it right into my palm, and I learn to trust you will not hit me in the face. A good mechanic never looks away from the engine. Trust gets people killed out in the wastes," I noted, watching Liam beam with pride. "But inside a garage, trust keeps the machine running." A strange, rhythmic rattling noise echoed from the far corner of the motor pool. A fat, scarred, armor-plated mutant armadillo squeezed out from beneath a rusted truck chassis. The beast weighed at least 40 pounds and missed the bottom half of its tail. As it waddled across the floor, its thick armor plates clacked together, sounding like a spilled toolbox.
Get away from the beast!
A perimeter guard shouted, jogging into the garage. He carried a battered rifle and a deep scowl.
I am Breck. That mutant menace bites ankles.
He hates everyone in this camp.
The armadillo stopped in the center of the room. It let out a grumpy, clicking hiss at the guard, shifting its weight, as if preparing to launch an attack. I crouched down on the concrete, unzipping my red backpack. I retrieved one of the peach cans I secured at the outpost. Pulling the metal tab, I peeled the lid back. The sweet, sugary aroma flooded the cold garage, cutting through the stench of exhaust. I speared a bright orange slice with my pocket knife, holding the fruit out toward the armored beast. "Truce?" I offered. The armadillo lifted its snout. Its grumpy demeanor vanished. Operating strictly on a bribery system, the mutant animal waddled forward at top speed. It snapped the peach slice off the blade, chewing the fruit with loud, obnoxious smacks. "His name is Scrap," I announced, scratching the armadillo behind his leathery ears. "He does not hate everyone. He just needs better catering." Breck stared at the creature, shaking his head in disgust before retreating to his post. I stood back up, surveying the chaotic motor pool. Between the orphan looking for guidance, the grumpy mechanic fighting my genius, and the bribe-hungry armadillo, the compound pulsed with a strange, frantic life. I found a sudden, terrifying sense of purpose hidden among the rusted junk. Chapter 5. The Wooden Toy. Night swallowed the Iron Claw compound, plunging the territory into freezing darkness. Ronan did not grant me a tour of the facilities. After finishing his meeting in the command center, the warlord escorted me to a sparse holding room on the ground floor. The space featured a single metal cot and a rusted water basin. He locked the heavy door from the outside, promising to discuss my role in the morning. "Every person who promises protection leaves you in a cage," I thought, staring at the concrete walls. "A wrench never lies, and a locked door never bargains." I sat on the edge of the cot, shivering in the cold draft. Surviving the dust barons required constant motion. Waiting for a feral predator to decide my fate violated every rule of independence I possessed. I needed leverage. I unlaced my left combat boot. Reaching into the inner lining, I retrieved a thin, rigid piece of salvaged steel wire. Approaching the door, I knelt on the cold floorboards. I slid the wire into the keyhole. I manipulated the tumblers, feeling for the distinct click of the internal pins. A specialist understands the anatomy of a machine, and a lock operates on simple, predictable mechanics. 10 seconds later, the deadbolt snapped back. I pushed the door open, slipping into the quiet corridor. The compound felt eerie under the moonlight. The pack defenders patrolled the outer walls, leaving the interior hallways empty. I crept through the shadows, mapping the layout of my new prison. Taking a narrow stairwell down into the lower quadrant, I hit a dead end. A heavy, imposing steel door blocked the subterranean passage. The barrier lacked a standard keyhole. It featured a complex pre-war biometric locking mechanism and thick reinforcement bars. What sits behind the heavy steel door in the lower quadrant? I traced my fingers over the cold metal. The pack hoarded scrap metal, but they guarded this specific room with military-grade precision. A faint scraping noise interrupted my investigation. I pulled my hand away from the vault. The sound echoed from the adjacent courtyard. I crept back up the stairs, following the noise to a side exit. Pushing the wooden door open a fraction of an inch, I peered into the dirt yard. A small burn barrel provided a meager circle of flickering orange light. Ronan sat on an overturned crate near the fire. He remained in his human form, his broad shoulders hunched forward, his attention entirely focused on the object in his lap. I expected the fearsome ruler to sharpen a combat blade or clean a salvaged rifle. Instead, the warlord held a small block of pine wood and a carving knife. I watched in stunned silence. The lethal predator moved the blade with delicate, measured precision. He carved 4 tiny wheels. He shaved down the edges to form a cab and a truck bed. He built a wooden toy truck. Wait, this idiot is actually kind. My brain misfired, struggling to process the contradiction. The man who tore a town apart for a spare tire spent his midnight hours carving toys for the pack orphans.
The beast wants to lock her in a cage to keep her safe.
Ronan's internal monologue raged as he carved the wood, fighting the possessive urge to guard my holding cell.
But a caged bird forgets how to fly. I must let her rest.
I stepped out of the shadows, my boots crunching loud against the gravel. Ronan snapped his head up, his sharp gaze locked onto my face. He did not look surprised to see me outside the locked room. He slipped the wooden toy into the pocket of his duster, hiding the evidence of his softness.
You breached the holding room.
Ronan stated, his voice a low rumble over the crackling fire. You left a standard 5-pin tumbler lock between me and my freedom, I countered, crossing my arms to fight the chill. I am a mechanic. I overhaul engines. A door lock is child's play.
You did not run for the perimeter.
He observed, standing up from the crate. The sheer heat radiating from his body pushed the winter air back.
You sought me out.
Running into the barrens at midnight guarantees a swift death, I reasoned, rolling my unlit matchstick across my tongue, and I refuse to die on an empty stomach. We need to strike a contract. He stepped closer, towering over my petite frame.
You demand terms from a warlord.
I demand a return on my investment, I corrected, pointing a finger at his chest. Your camp runs on failing infrastructure. The lights in the corridor flicker every 10 seconds. Your perimeter generators burn dirty fuel. I fixed 1 unit today, but the rest will fail before the week ends. I can overhaul your entire grid. Ronan crossed his arms, evaluating my proposal. He knew the camp faced a mechanical crisis. Old Man Griff lacked the skills to maintain the pre-war tech.
In exchange?
Ronan asked. In exchange, I require 3 hot meals a day, a guaranteed supply of canned fruit, and a bed that does not reside in a freezing prison cell. I listed my demands without a flinch of hesitation. The ruler of the Ironclaw Pack stared down at me. A captive dictating terms defied the natural order of the Wasteland. Yet, the corners of his mouth twitched. He respected the audacity.
Agreed,
Ronan declared, offering his giant, calloused hand. I ignored the gesture. Human bones snap under shifter strength, and I needed my fingers intact. Show me to the new quarters. He dropped his hand, a smug smirk breaking through his stoic mask. The warlord turned and led the way toward the penthouse, unaware that he just hired the most stubborn anchor in the territory. Chapter 6. Morning broke over the compound with a glaring, pale light. I wasted 0 time enjoying my new accommodations. Leaving the sleeping Alpha in the penthouse, I hauled my tools down to the motor pool. Scrap the armadillo waited near the entrance. The mutant pet abandoned his perimeter patrol, prioritizing the mechanic who promised him fruit. His thick armor plates clattered against the concrete, creating a rhythmic soundtrack to my morning labor. I spent the first 2 hours overhauling a salvaged generator turbine. The machine sat in pieces across my workbench. Hutch, the cheerful pack cook, strolled into the garage carrying a steaming tin plate of roasted desert game. He possessed a round belly and a booming laugh.
Breakfast for the genius,
Hutch announced, setting the plate near my tools.
I heard you embarrassed Griff yesterday. The old man is furious.
Griff patches holes with duct tape, I replied, grabbing a piece of the roasted meat. I am saving his life. Do you need the spark plugs for the kitchen stove?
3 of them.
Hutch nodded, slipping the fresh plugs into his apron.
You keep my burners hot. I keep your plate full. That is a solid Wasteland trade.
After finishing the meal, I wiped the grease from my hands and initiated a perimeter inspection. A solid foundation requires a thorough evaluation of the weakest points. I walked the interior edge of the metal fencing, scrap waddling right behind my boots. I stopped at the east gate. The massive iron doors looked imposing from a distance, but the structural reality painted a grim picture. I crouched down, scraping my pocket knife against the bottom hinges. Flakes of orange rust rained onto the dirt. The metal flaked away like dry pastry crust. Heavy, familiar boots crunched against the gravel behind me.
You wander far from the motor pool.
Ronan rumbled. I stood up, turning to face the warlord. Your east gate is compromised. The bottom hinges suffer from severe oxidation. A targeted blast will rip these doors clean off the frame. Ronan glanced at the rusted metal, his expression flat.
The Sandskull rogues attack the west gate. The main highway leads directly to the western wall. They do not possess the tactical discipline to flank through the eastern ridge.
Russ does not care about tactical discipline, I argued, pointing my knife at the failing joint. The foundation here is rotten. If Jax hits this side of the compound, the metal will fold.
Strength goes where the enemy is.
Ronan dismissed my warning, his stubborn flaw taking control. He believed brute force solved every obstacle.
I ordered Griff to reinforce the west gate with surplus steel. We meet the threat head-on.
Every person who promises protection ignores the cracks until the wall falls, I thought, a bitter edge tightening my chest. A shield only works if you hold it in the right direction, I challenged, refusing to drop the issue. You are leaving the back door wide open. Let me pull the surplus steel and weld a brace across these hinges.
You will return to the motor pool and finish the generator overhaul.
Ronan commanded, his tone leaving zero room for debate.
I command the defensive strategy. You fix the engines.
I stared at the scarred predator. He operated under the delusion that his physical power insulated the pack from mechanical failure. I slid the unlit pine stick between my teeth, tasting the sulfur tip. When this gate drops, do not ask me to fix the mess, I warned, turning on my heel. I marched back toward the garage, scrap rattling in my wake. The warlord chose to trust his arrogance over my expertise. The dust barons punished arrogance with lethal precision, and the Ironclaw pack stood right in the crosshairs. Chapter 7. The dust barons delivered chaos without warning. A violent, shrieking wind slammed into the Ironclaw compound, carrying a blinding wall of abrasive grit. The sky turned a suffocating shade of bruised purple, plunging the afternoon into premature twilight. I stood in the motor pool, tightening a manifold bolt on the salvage generator. The sudden drop in barometric pressure popped my ears. A harsh mechanical klaxon wailed over the howling gale, signaling a perimeter alert. Trust gets people killed, I reminded myself, wiping a streak of black grease from my forehead. A solid wall keeps you breathing, but only if the hinges hold. Old Man Griff dropped his wrench. The tool hit the concrete floor with a sharp clatter.
Dust storm!
He shouted, pulling a frayed bandana over his nose and mouth.
Visibility is 0. Secure the salvage.
Mechanics scrambled in the dim garage, dragging loose tools and exposed engine blocks away from the open bay doors. The wind ripped through the workspace, knocking empty fuel canisters across the cracked pavement. Liam sat on his stack of tires, his small hands gripping his knees. The 10-year-old orphan stared at the swirling dust, his wide eyes reflecting pure, unfiltered panic. He lacked the hardened combat instincts of the adult wolves. I shoved my socket set into my red canvas backpack and walked over to the boy. Get under the workbench, Liam, I instructed, keeping my voice steady. Keep your head down and cover your ears. Before the boy could move, a deafening metallic shriek tore through the storm. The sound did not come from the west gate, where Alpha Ronan positioned his vanguard. The noise echoed from the opposite side of the compound. The rusted, oxidized hinges of the east gate groaned under a kinetic impact. A second, louder crash followed. The failing steel joints buckled, snapping like dry twigs. The heavy iron doors collapsed into the dirt with a ground-shaking thud. The perimeter was breached. A foul, oppressive stench rolled through the open gap, cutting through the swirling dust. Sour sweat and decaying meat assaulted my senses, triggering a primal warning in my gut. The Sandskull rogues brought the rot of the wasteland straight into the sanctuary.
Eastgate!
A perimeter guard screamed, raising a battered rifle.
They flanked us!
Shadowy silhouettes poured through the swirling grit. The invaders wore tattered canvas vests and wielded rusted iron pipes. They bypassed the heavily guarded western wall, striking the exact weak point I diagnosed hours ago. Ronan ignored the warning. He trusted his brute strength over a mechanic's structural assessment, and his arrogance just invited a slaughter into his home. The mechanics in the motor pool drew combat blades, rushing forward to form a desperate defensive line. The rogues clashed with the defenders, the sounds of tearing fabric and breaking bone echoing over the wind. A gaunt, tattooed rogue broke past Old Man Griff. The attacker sprinted toward the rear of the garage, his wild gaze locking onto the easiest target in the room. He raised a jagged piece of scrap metal, charging straight for the stack of tires where Liam sat frozen in terror. I did not carry a firearm. My steel lug wrench rested at the bottom of my backpack, out of reach. Surviving the barrens required extreme improvisation. I spun toward the nearest welding station. A heavy steel canister of pressurized aerosol solvent sat next to a butane cutting torch. I grabbed the aerosol can in my left hand and snatched the torch in my right. Striking the flint striker against the metal table, I sparked a tight, blue flame at the tip of the brass nozzle. A specialized mechanic uses the right tools, my brain calculated, adrenaline flooding my veins. A desperate survivor builds her own. I stepped in front of Liam, placing my body between the orphan and the charging rogue. The attacker let out a barking laugh, anticipating a quick kill. He swung the jagged scrap metal toward my collarbone. I raised the aerosol can, aligning the plastic nozzle right over the blue flame of the welding torch. I pressed the trigger. A pressurized stream of chemical solvent sprayed over the open fire. The liquid ignited on contact, creating a roaring, 10-foot pillar of orange flame. The improvised flamethrower illuminated the dark garage, blasting the rogue right in the chest. The attacker shrieked in agony. The scorching heat caught his tattered canvas vest, setting the fabric ablaze. He dropped his weapon, stumbling backward into the dirt courtyard, clawing at his burning clothes. "Stay behind me, Liam," I yelled over the roar of the fire, keeping my finger hovering over the aerosol trigger. Through the haze of the dust storm, a towering figure sprinted across the compound. Alpha Ronan abandoned the west gate, his heavy boots tearing up the earth. His dark gray tank top clung to his chest. His intense gaze locked onto the collapsed iron doors of the east gate, sheer horror twisting his rugged features. The warlord realized his mistake. His refusal to listen brought the enemy right to the pack orphans. He saw me standing in front of Liam, wielding a makeshift pillar of fire against his enemies. 3 more Sandskull rogues poured through the breach, their gazes fixing on the motor pool. They saw their burning comrade and drew salvaged machetes, fanning out to flank my position. I pressed the aerosol trigger again, sweeping the fire in a wide arc to keep them at bay. The heat blistered the air. The rogues hesitated, shielding their faces from the inferno. The chemical stream sputtered. The aerosol can grew freezing cold in my grip, a stark indicator of dropping internal pressure. The orange flame shrank to a meager, flickering burst before dying completely. The solvent tank was empty. I dropped the useless metal canister onto the concrete. The flanking rogues smirked. Recognizing my defenseless state, they raised their blades and charged forward. I shoved Liam under the steel workbench, bracing my stance to fight a losing battle with bare hands. Chapter 8. The howling dust storm masked the approach of the third rogue. While 2 attackers charged the front of the motor pool, a third enemy circled behind a gutted sedan. He bypassed the brutal hand-to-hand combat raging across the perimeter, opting for a cowardly, ranged execution. The rogue stepped out from the swirling grit, a vicious sneer painted across his dirt-streaked face. He raised a salvaged, double-barreled shotgun, leveling the rusted steel directly at my chest. Every person who promises protection leaves. The bitter thought flashed through my mind. My boots rooted to the concrete. I possessed 0 cover. The workbench offered shelter for Liam, but left my torso exposed to the incoming blast. I braced for the inevitable impact, locking my jaw. A heavy, armor-plated blur launched out of the shadows. Scrap the mutant armadillo hurled his 40-pound body across the garage floor. The grumpy pet executed a flawless tactical strike, tucking his scarred head away and slamming into the rogue's ankles with the force of a wrecking ball. The attacker lost his footing. The shotgun barrel jerked upward just as his finger squeezed the trigger. A deafening boom shattered the air. A flash of bright yellow fire erupted from the weapon. The heavy projectile missed my chest, tearing through the freezing dust. Alpha Ronan dove into the trajectory of the blast. The warlord threw his broad frame between me and the rogue, utilizing his own body as a physical shield. The rogue meant to kill the mechanic, but the Mountain King refused to let his arrogance claim a life. The shotgun slug slammed into the right side of Ronan's ribs. The impact knocked the giant Alpha off balance. He staggered backward, a harsh, jagged grunt tearing from his throat. Shifters healed from ordinary bullet wounds in a matter of hours, pushing the lead out of their muscle tissue with ease. This projectile did not behave normally. A foul, acrid hiss echoed from the entry wound, A thick plume of black necrotic smoke rose from his side, fighting the swirling sand. The sand skull rogue utilized a silver-plated slug. Werewolves cannot touch silver. I remembered the brutal lore of the Wasteland. The toxic metal burned through his flesh upon contact, rotting the tissue in a rapid, agonizing chemical reaction. The poison hit his bloodstream, acting as a biological anchor that halted any attempt to shift into his stronger, feral form. Ronan dropped to one knee, clutching his side. Dark, black blood spilled over his thick fingers, staining the dry earth beneath his boots. Apex predators do not fall. The sight of his blood pooling in the dirt sent a cold spike of genuine terror straight through my ribs. The invincible ruler of the Dust Barons knelt in the dirt, crippled by a single piece of tainted metal. The rogue scrambled to his feet, kicking the armadillo away. He pumped the shotgun to load the second shell. He intended to finish the job and claim the territory for his feral leader. Before the attacker could level the barrel, Beta Bram emerged from the fog. The pragmatic wolf drove the hilt of his combat blade into the rogue's temple, knocking the invader unconscious against the concrete floor. The turning tide of the battle echoed through the camp. The Iron Claw defenders rallied behind their fallen alpha, pushing the remaining Sand Skull forces back toward the ruined East Gate. Realizing their assassination attempt failed, the surviving rogues abandoned their comrades and retreated into the howling wasteland, swallowed by the blinding dust. The klaxon alarm finally sputtered and died, leaving the courtyard in a ringing, tense silence. I dropped to my knees beside the wounded warlord. The wolf-blooded heat radiating from his skin spiked into a dangerous, erratic fever. His sharp focus looked hazy, fighting the overwhelming pain of the toxic burn. The silver rot ate at his muscles, turning his accelerated healing into a useless defense.
Do not touch the wound.
Ronan choked out, his jaw locked tight against the agony.
The silver burns human skin.
I have thick leather gloves, I argued, grabbing his uninjured arm to keep him upright. The heavy hide protected my palms, but the sight of his failing strength terrified me. Bram! Get the healer! The beta hauled the unconscious rogue out of the way and rushed to our side. He hooked his shoulder under Ronan's arm, taking the bulk of the warlord's weight.
We need him on a surgical table,
Bram ordered, his pragmatic features lined with dread. Together, we dragged the bleeding predator out of the chaotic motor pool. We left the howling storm behind, moving toward the reinforced concrete bunker housing the medical wing. The Iron Claw pack won the skirmish, but the cost of Ronan's stubborn pride threatened to end his reign. Chapter 9. Dragging a towering, incapacitated warlord across the compound required leverage, stubborn grit, and a complete disregard for personal muscle fatigue. Beta Bram and I hauled Alpha Ronan through the heavy iron doors of the medical bunker, our boots slipping on the smooth floor. Healer Maeve stood next to a rusted steel surgical table, sorting a tray of cruel-looking metal instruments. The stern pack doctor possessed zero bedside manner and a reputation for brutal efficiency. She took one look at the black smoke rising from Ronan's side and pointed a gloved finger at the flat metal surface.
"Get him on the table,"
Maeve ordered, her voice carrying a sharp, uncompromising authority.
"Keep his shoulders pinned. The extraction procedure carries a high risk of bone fractures if he thrashes."
Bram and I hoisted the warlord onto the cold steel. Ronan gritted his teeth, suppressing a jagged groan as his back hit the hard surface. The feral aura radiating from his skin carried a harsh, bitter undertone of physical distress. Maeve approached the table. She pulled a pair of thick, heavy-duty welding leathers over her hands and forearms. Shifter biology rejected silver upon contact. Touching the toxic metal without thick protection meant suffering identical, agonizing burns. She grabbed a pair of long steel tongs from her tray and leaned over the wounded Alpha.
"The Sand Skull rogues use jagged slugs,"
Maeve noted, assessing the smoking crater in his ribs.
"The metal splinters upon impact. I need to dig deep to scrape the shrapnel out of the muscle tissue."
Ronan locked his jaw, his thick fingers gripping the edges of the steel table. The knuckles on his broad hands turned a stark, bone white. I should be halfway to the scrap outpost by now, I thought, staring at the blood soaking his dark gray tank top. Abandoning a broken engine is logical. Staying to hold the pieces together is reckless. I stepped forward, abandoning my spot near the door. Moving right up to the edge of the rusted table, I grabbed Ronan's uninjured left arm. I lacked the physical bulk to pin a shifting werewolf, but sheer audacity provided a potent substitute for muscle. I dug my leather-gloved hands into his bicep, anchoring my stance against the concrete floor.
Do it.
Ronan rasped, his chest heaving with erratic breaths. Maeve plunged the steel tongs into the smoking wound. The warlord roared. The sound erupted from his chest, a raw, guttural display of sheer torment that shook the dust from the ceiling. His heavy frame bucked against the table. The beast inside his mind panicked, reacting to the invasion of toxic metal with a violent surge of adrenaline. Bram threw his upper body weight across Ronan's chest, struggling to hold the thrashing predator down.
Hold the line, Alpha.
The struggle threatened to upend the surgical table. Maeve cursed, fighting to keep her tools steady inside the ruined muscle. If the tongs slipped, the silver shards would tear deeper into his vital organs. "Stop acting like an oversized toddler," I scolded, keeping my tone brisk and commanding. "You survived a shotgun blast. You can survive a pair of oversized tweezers. Hold still before she punctures a lung." Ronan snapped his head toward my voice. His hazy vision found my face. The sharp, bossy reprimand pierced the feral panic clouding his mind. He stopped thrashing. His broad chest continued to heave, but the violent bucking ceased. He focused his intense gaze on my features, using my steady grip to ground his spiraling agony.
You give terrible medical advice.
Ronan managed to grind out, his voice a vibrating rumble of pain. "I am a mechanic, not a nurse," I countered, squeezing his arm. "I fix machines. You are currently operating like a stalled engine block. Let the mechanic work." Maeve utilized the sudden stillness to her advantage. She twisted the steel tongs, clamping the heavy jaws around the largest piece of the silver slug. With a swift, brutal yank, she pulled the toxic metal out of his flesh. She tossed the smoking shrapnel into a designated waste bucket, the chunk of silver hitting the bottom with a loud clang. The worst of the danger passed, but the damage remained. The pack doctor retrieved a sealed glass jar from her supply shelf. Unscrewing the lid, she scooped out a generous handful of cold, gritty sludge. The bitterroot paste looked like congealed swamp water. She pressed the herbal mixture deep into the cleaned wound. The paste neutralized the remaining silver residue, stopping the chemical burn. The thin trail of black smoke vanished from the air. Ronan let out a long, shaky exhale. The rigid tension bled from his broad shoulders, his heavy frame slumping against the cold steel table. The poison drained his vast energy reserves, leaving him unconscious.
"The rot is contained,"
Maeve declared, stripping the contaminated welding leathers from her hands.
"but his accelerated healing is compromised. The fever will spike tonight. He requires strict observation."
Bram nodded, his pragmatic features lined with exhaustion.
We will transfer him to the penthouse.
I released Ronan's arm, taking a step back from the surgical table. My thick leather gloves were smeared with dark, necrotic blood. I needed to clean the toxic residue from the hide before it soaked through the stitching. Glancing around the sterile room, I spotted the warlord's weathered leather duster resting on a nearby chair. Maeve discarded the coat before the surgery. I picked up the heavy garment. I used the thick interior lining to wipe the grime and blood from my gloves, ruining the expensive fabric without a second thought. The chill of the concrete bunker seeped into my bones. Shivering, I wrapped the oversized leather duster around my own shoulders, letting the heavy material swallow my petite frame. Ronan shifted on the steel table. His eyes fluttered open for a brief, lucid second. He looked across the room. He saw me wearing his signature coat, the hem dragging near my boots. He did not demand his property back. He did not issue a booming reprimand. The warlord simply closed his eyes again, a faint, contented sigh escaping his lips. He silently approved of the theft, proving the brutal Mountain King harbored a quiet, devastating softness for the mechanic who saved his life. Chapter 10. Hauling the Alpha up the winding iron staircase pushed my physical limits to the breaking point. Beta Bram took the brunt of the weight, hooking his thick shoulder under Ronan's uninjured arm. I walked on the opposite side, keeping my hands pressed against the warlord's hip to steady his stumbling gait. The toxic silver burn on his ribs throbbed with every step. We reached the penthouse. Bram kicked the heavy steel door open, hauling the Alpha across the floorboards. They collapsed together onto the sprawling, fur-lined mattress in the corner. Ronan let out a harsh grunt, his jaw locked tight against the agony. Bram straightened up, his chest heaving. The pragmatic second-in-command wiped sweat from his brow.
The perimeter needs reinforcement.
Bram stated, pointing a thumb toward the door.
The Sandskull rogues retreated, but Jax might regroup for a night raid. I must organize the watch.
Go, I instructed, pulling the oversized leather duster tighter around my shoulders. I have the watch up here. Bram offered a stiff nod. He marched out of the room, shutting the heavy door behind him. The deadbolt clicked into place, sealing me inside the quiet sanctuary with a failing apex predator. A broken machine needs time to cool down before you rebuild the engine block, I reminded myself, stepping closer to the mattress. But this particular machine runs on feral biology. Ronan lay flat on his back. The thick furs sat pushed down to his waist. Healer Maeve's white bandages wrapped tight around his torso, holding the bitterroot paste against the ruined muscle. The herbal sludge contained the silver rot, but his immune system fought a brutal, chaotic war against the lingering poison. The warlord transformed into an unregulated furnace. Scalding heat poured from his broad chest, baking the stagnant air inside the enclosed room. The temperature climbed higher with every labored breath he took. A sheen of sweat coated his scarred skin, reflecting the dim glow of the battery-powered lantern resting on the floorboards. I walked over to the small, rusted basin near the planning table. I grabbed a clean rag, soaking the rough fabric in cold water. Wringing out the excess moisture, I returned to the bed. I folded the damp cloth and pressed it against his forehead. Ronan flinched, a ragged exhale escaping his lips. His feverish gaze shifted beneath heavy, half-closed lids. The blistering air radiating from his body felt thick and oppressive, heavy with sickness. "Stop brooding," I ordered, picking up a wooden match from the table. I slid the unlit pine stick between my teeth, seeking the familiar, calming texture. Fever burns out the infection. You just need to sweat out the bad fuel.
The beast is restless.
Ronan rasped, his voice a gravelly, broken rumble. His large hands gripped the edges of the fur blankets. The knuckles turned stark white under the strain.
The silver traps the shift. It cages the wolf. He wants to hunt the men who breach the gates.
The wolf needs to take a nap, I countered, crossing my arms over my chest. You cannot hunt a field mouse in your current condition. You look like run-over roadkill. A faint, strained chuckle vibrated in his throat, triggering a wince as the movement pulled his fresh bandages. My lack of reverence for his terrifying reputation acted as a strange balm to his fractured mind. The rest of his pack hovered in fear, treating him like a fragile artifact. I treated him like a defective turbine needing a tune-up. The humor faded from his face, replaced by a grim, rigid tension. He stared up at the ceiling, fighting a battle against his own stubborn pride. The ruler of the Dust Barons did not apologize. He did not admit defeat.
You warned me about the rust.
Ronan murmured, the words grinding out of his throat. I stopped chewing my matchstick. I looked down at him, surprised by the sudden confession.
You warned me the east gate hinges were compromised.
He continued, turning his head to meet my gaze.
I ignored the structural assessment. I told you strength goes where the enemy is.
And the enemy went where the rust was, I finished the thought, keeping my tone flat.
My arrogance brought the Sandskull rogues into the courtyard.
Ronan admitted. The confession hit the room like a physical blow. The Mountain King swallowed his pride, bearing his fatal flaw.
I put the orphans in danger. I put you in danger. If you did not build that fire weapon.
His voice trailed off. He closed his eyes, the guilt wrapping around his chest tighter than the bandages. I stared at the wounded predator. He jumped in front of a shotgun blast to fix his mistake. He took a toxic bullet meant for my ribs, using his own flesh as a shield. Every person who promises protection leaves, my core lie echoed in my mind, a bitter defense mechanism forged in the ashes of a betrayed settlement. Trust gets people killed. My father trusted a fortified town. He believed the council leaders when they promised safety. They sold us out to a raider gang for a shipment of clean water. My father died holding a wrench, fighting to give me enough time to run. Since that day, I trusted spark plugs. I trusted fuel lines. I refused to trust a living soul. But the man bleeding on the mattress just shattered that rule. He did not run. He did not sell me out. He stood between me and the fire. "You took the hit," I said, pulling the wooden stick from my mouth. A bad mechanic ignores a warning. A good mechanic takes the damage to keep the engine running. "You kept the engine running, Ronan." He opened his eyes. The raw, unfiltered relief in his expression hit me like a punch to the gut. He needed the absolution. He needed his mate to forgive the miscalculation. A rhythmic, clacking noise echoed from the far corner of the penthouse. Scrap the mutant armadillo waddled out from under the planning table. The grumpy, armor-plated pet navigated the room with singular purpose. Ignoring the injured alpha, Scrap lumbered right up to my boots. The beast let out a clicking hiss, demanding his evening tribute. "You are a terrible guard dog," I told the armadillo, crouching down to retrieve a cracked piece of dried jerky from my pocket. I handed the tough meat to the mutant. Scrap snatched the offering, chewed with loud smacks, and executed his signature bowling ball defense. He curled his 40-pound body into a tight, impenetrable sphere right against my toes. He utilized my presence as a personal shield while he went to sleep.
He possesses terrible loyalty,
Ronan observed, watching the traitorous pet. "He possesses excellent priorities," I corrected. I stood back up, evaluating the seating arrangements. The room lacked chairs. The only available resting place was the sprawling mattress, currently occupied by a very hot werewolf. Surviving the freezing desert night usually required huddling in the cab of my rust-orange Ford Ranger. Tonight, the desert cold stood zero chance against the warlord's toxic fever. Crawling onto the left side of the mattress, I kept a strict 2-foot perimeter between my body and his bandaged torso. I rested my back against the sturdy headboard, pulling my knees to my chest. The radiant heat washed over my clothes, soothing the lingering aches from the battle. Ronan turned his head on the pillow. The wild entity in his mind demanded proximity, craving the physical anchor to weather the biological storm. He shifted his heavy frame, inching across the mattress. He closed the 2-foot gap, ignoring the sharp twinge of pain in his ribs. He stopped only when his broad, scorching shoulder bumped against my knee. The physical contact sent a jolt of static energy straight through my bones. He did not attempt to grab me or force a closer embrace. He simply required the reassurance of touch. His breathing slowed. The frantic, erratic rhythm leveled out as the presence of his mechanic grounded his feral panic. I stared out the reinforced blast windows, listening to the howling wind. The Iron Claw pack faced a brutal war, and I just tied my fate to their prime target. I dropped the chewed match onto the floorboards. Earning my 10,000 salvage credits for the green zone no longer mattered. My rigid independence cracked, leaving room for a very stubborn anchor. Chapter 11. The following evening brought a different kind of dread to the Dust Barons. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in deep bruises of purple and black. The lingering dust storm settled, leaving the air still and freezing. Tonight, the imposing sphere of the full moon demanded tribute. I stood in the center of the penthouse, my arms crossed over my chest. The room felt suffocating. Alpha Ronan paced the floorboards like a caged predator. His heavy boots pounded a relentless, agitated rhythm against the wood. The silver wound on his side carried fresh pink scar tissue, his accelerated biology conquering the fever during the day. The toxic burn left him agitated, and the impending lunar shift rubbed his frayed nerves raw. Shifter biology adhered to strict, unbreakable rules. A warlord maintained control over his shifts during normal circumstances, transforming only when combat required feral strength. The full moon stripped that choice away. The lunar pull acted as a biological mandate, forcing the human body into a mandatory, violent shift.
The transition carries high risks,
Ronan warned, stopping his restless pacing to glare out the reinforced blast windows.
The beast takes control. My human consciousness recedes into the background. I cannot guarantee your safety if you remain in my proximity.
I am resourceful, I reminded him, keeping my voice steady despite the spike of genuine anxiety in my chest. I survived the Barons this long. I can stay out of your way.
You do not understand the shift.
Ronan growled, his gaze flashing with dread. He crossed the room, his broad frame blocking the ambient light.
I weigh 300 pounds in my feral form. I possess bone-crushing jaw strength. The wolf is obsessed with you. If the beast takes control tonight, you lack the physical power to stop him.
The giant apex predator is terrified of accidentally hurting me, I realized, watching the muscles in his neck jump. That makes the impending moon shift feel dangerously real.
Beta Bram prepared the holding cells.
Ronan continued, his jaw locked tight against the rising biological pressure.
I will lock myself in the lower quadrant. You will remain in the penthouse. Do not wander the corridors. Do not open this steel door until dawn.
I am coming with you to lock the door, I decided, grabbing the straps of my red canvas backpack. I want to see the architecture of this holding cell. A bad lock means a loose wolf. Ronan let out a harsh sigh, lacking the energy to argue. He turned on his heel, marching out of the penthouse. I followed him down the winding iron staircase. We bypassed the main armory and headed toward the dead end in the lower quadrant. We stopped in front of the heavy, imposing steel door I discovered the night before. The barrier lacked a standard keyhole, featuring thick reinforcement bars and a complex biometric scanner. Ronan pressed his large palm against the glass panel. A green light flashed. The heavy steel door hissed, the pressurized seals releasing with a loud mechanical groan. He pushed the barrier open. I stepped over the threshold, my jaw dropping. The corridor beyond the door did not resemble a makeshift wasteland camp. Smooth, poured concrete formed a perfect, seamless arch. Fluorescent light strips buzzed overhead, powered by an independent, isolated grid. This is a decommissioned pre-war military bunker, I realized, my mechanic instincts firing on all cylinders. That explains the Dodge Charger. The pack stripped the surplus armor plating from the military vehicles left in the motor pool. My father served as a military mechanic before the world fell apart, I whispered, running my gloved hand along the pristine concrete wall. He taught me how to hotwire pre-war tech. This infrastructure is flawless. It can withstand a localized nuclear blast.
It withstands the moon,
Ronan corrected, leading me down the hall. We passed a large, reinforced room with a reinforced glass viewing pane. Inside, dozens of children sat on cots, playing with salvaged toys and reading worn books. Liam sat in the corner, tossing a rubber ball against the wall.
The orphans stay in the safe wing,
Ronan explained, gesturing to the room.
The reinforced steel protects them during raids and shields them from the shifting adults. They are secure.
We left the safe wing behind, descending a ramp into the detention block. The air in the corridor felt thick and charged with primal energy. A row of heavy iron cages lined the concrete walls, built to hold enemy combatants and volatile pack members during the lunar cycle. Ronan stopped in front of the final, largest holding cell at the end of the block. He stepped inside the cage. He grabbed the heavy iron door, pulling the barrier shut. The mechanical lock engaged with a definitive, isolating thud. He stood behind the bars, his hands gripping the iron. The silver edge of the full moon crested the horizon outside, and the biological clock struck 0. A terrifying, bone-chilling howl erupted from the upper levels of the compound. A chorus of answering howls joined the first, as the Iron Claw pack succumbed to the lunar pull. Ronan dropped to his knees. A harsh, visceral grunt tore from his throat. The shift did not involve magical, painless transitions. It required breaking bones, snapping joints, and reshaping a human skeleton into a feral nightmare. I watched, horrified, but clinical. The sound of his spine cracking echoed against the concrete. His skin tore, replaced by thick, midnight-colored fur. The transformation looked like an engine block tearing itself apart to rebuild into a specialized weapon. 3 minutes later, a giant black wolf stood in the center of the cage. The beast possessed shoulders broad enough to eclipse the overhead lights. Thick fur bristled along his spine. A patch of stark, white fur marked the right side of his ribs, an eternal reminder of the toxic silver wound. The wolf threw his heavy body against the iron bars, letting out a roaring, guttural snarl that shook the dust from the ceiling. The human warlord vanished, leaving only the monster behind. "I will see you in the morning, Ronan," I murmured, turning away from the cage. I walked back up the ramp, leaving the detention block to the mercy of the moon. Chapter 12. The penthouse felt like a tomb. I sat cross-legged on the sprawling mattress, rolling the wooden matchstick over my tongue. The howling from the lower levels faded into a chorus of restless growls. The Iron Claw pack settled into their feral forms, enduring the agonizing surge of lunar energy. Scrap the mutant armadillo snored near my boots. The grumpy pet curled into a tight, armored sphere, oblivious to the supernatural chaos raging below our floorboards. I stared out the blast windows at the desolate dust barrens. A mechanical problem requires a logical diagnosis, and my brain refused to shut down. Wolves burn a tremendous amount of energy during the shift, I calculated, pulling the match from my lips. Reshaping a skeletal structure consumes vast fuel reserves. Ronan spent the last 24 hours fighting off a toxic fever. He missed 3 meals. His tank is running on fumes. A machine running on empty fuel lines seizes up and dies. A biological predator running on a calorie deficit turns reckless and volatile. "I refuse to let my space heater starve," I told the sleeping armadillo. I grabbed my red canvas backpack, sliding my arms through the straps. Earning my keep in the dust barrens meant taking care of the pack's infrastructure, and the warlord ranked as the most important piece of heavy machinery in the compound. Slipping out of the penthouse, I descended the winding iron staircase. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the silent courtyard. I bypassed the motor pool and headed straight for the communal kitchens in the eastern wing. The kitchen sat empty. The large industrial stoves radiated residual warmth. I raided the heavy steel cooling lockers, retrieving a large metal bucket filled with thick, roasted cuts of desert game. The meat smelled rich and savory, a sharp contrast to the grit of the wasteland. Gripping the heavy bucket by the wire handle, I navigated the dim corridors back toward the lower quadrant. I passed through the biometric steel door, the military-grade hinges operating in total silence. I bypassed the children's safe wing, stepping onto the ramp that led down to the detention block. The atmosphere in the subterranean corridor felt suffocating. Low, vibrating growls echoed from the row of cells. Walking down the aisle, I stuck to the exact center of the concrete floor. The lesser pack members threw their feral bodies against the iron bars, driven mad by the scent of the roasted meat swinging in my hand. Their snapping jaws missed my arms by mere inches. "Fear is a rust that eats the foundation," I reminded myself, keeping my gaze locked straight ahead. Human biology blocked the psychological weight of their alpha aggression, but only the heavy steel cages kept me from becoming a midnight snack. I stopped in front of the final holding cell at the end of the block. The space lay steeped in pitch-black shadow. The giant black wolf paced the back wall of the enclosure. He stood on 4 legs, his back level with my chest. The beast stopped pacing. He turned his terrifying, oversized head toward the iron bars. His glowing stare locked onto my face, burning with an unfiltered, predatory fire. A guttural, chest-rattling snarl vibrated from his throat. "Use your inside voice," I scolded, tossing the chewed matchstick onto the floorboards. "You are giving the rest of the pack a headache, and I am not impressed by your temper tantrum." The giant black wolf froze. The wild, untamed entity in his mind recognized the bossy, sarcastic tone. The feral panic driving his restless pacing evaporated, replaced by a sudden, intense focus. He stalked forward, his heavy paws making zero sound against the concrete. He stopped mere inches from the thick iron bars, towering over my petite frame. The fierce, familiar warmth radiating from his fur wrapped around my senses, pushing back the damp chill of the bunker. I lifted the heavy metal bucket, angling the rim toward the gaps in the bars. "You burn through calories faster than a busted engine burns oil," I instructed, shaking the bucket. "Eat the meat before you pass out from exhaustion. You need the fuel." The warlord did not look at the roasted game. He ignored the high-calorie offering. Instead, he lowered his giant, terrifying snout, pushing his wet nose through the vertical space between the iron bars. He aimed straight for the center of my chest. He let out a high-pitched, miserable whine that sounded out of place coming from an apex predator. The beast did not want food. He wanted his anchor. The lunar shift stripped away his stoic warlord exterior, leaving behind a frantic animal desperate for physical reassurance. He needed to know his mate survived the night. "You are a very needy space heater," I muttered, setting the metal bucket down on the cold floor. I took a step forward, closing the distance to the cage. I reached my hands through the iron bars, burying my bare fingers deep into the coarse black fur on the sides of his broad neck. The raw heat pouring off his body soaked into my skin, warming my freezing joints. The alpha let out a long, rumbling sigh of profound relief. He leaned his heavy weight against the iron bars, pressing his snout against the front of my thermal shirt. The feral beast surrendered his territorial aggression, tamed by the simple presence of a human mechanic. I stood in the dim corridor, scratching the giant wolf behind the ears, while the rest of the pack howled at the moon. The dust barons bred ruthless killers, but survival required knowing exactly when to drop the heavy wrench and offer a steady hand instead. Chapter 13. Dawn breached the jagged horizon of the dust barons, casting a pale, gray light through the high iron grates of the detention block. I sat on the cold concrete floor, my back pressed against the wall. The echoing silence of the underground corridor felt heavy, thick with the aftermath of a brutal night. The mandatory lunar shift demanded an exhausting biological toll from the Ironclaw pack. The frantic snarls and pacing subsided an hour ago, replaced by a chorus of rough, ragged breathing. The reverse transformation began. Flesh replaced fur. The wet, sickening snap of shifting bones echoed from the holding cells. The process offered zero mercy. Reshaping a skeletal structure required enduring raw, brutal torment. Grunts of harsh pain vibrated through the iron bars as the wolves returned to their human forms. I pushed myself up from the concrete, gripping the oversized collar of Ronan's leather duster. The coat swallowed my petite frame, the hem dragging near my duct-taped boots. Stepping toward the largest cell at the end of the block, I peered through the thick metal barriers. Alpha Ronan leaned his broad back against the rear wall, his head tipped back against the stone. He wore the gray sweatpants Beta Bram provided the night before, his chest bare to the ambient chill. The silver-inflicted wound on his side stood out against his scarred skin, angry and inflamed from the brutal exertion of the shift. Sweat coated his forehead. The fever heat radiating from his frame felt weaker than usual, a stark indicator of his depleted energy reserves. "You survived the moon," I stated, keeping my tone brisk. The warlord lowered his chin, his heavy gaze locked onto my face. The feral wildness of the full moon receded, leaving behind a pragmatic, exhausted leader.
The beast remembers your proximity.
Ronan rasped, his gravelly voice stripped of its usual booming push.
He demands to know why you stand on the wrong side of the iron bars.
"I possess a strong aversion to getting trampled," I answered, pulling a wooden match from my pocket and placing the unlit pine between my teeth. Heavy boots descended the winding iron staircase. Beta Bram rounded the corner, gripping a ring of brass keys. The tall second-in-command looked pale and drained. His rigid posture sagged. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. He shoved a heavy key into the lock of Ronan's cell, twisting the mechanism with a loud metallic clack. The iron door groaned open. Ronan pushed off the wall, his boots dragged against the concrete for a fraction of a second before he forced his muscles to obey. He refused to show weakness in front of his subordinates, but the silver rot lingering in his system made every step a calculated effort. A post-apocalyptic warlord, suffering from a lunar hangover, requires boundless patience and a steady supply of hydration. I walked over to the cell's rusted sink, filled a dented tin cup with cold water, and shoved the metal against his solid chest. He took the cup without a word, draining the supply in 3 fast gulps. We ascended the iron staircase, leaving the quiet detention block behind. The surface level of the compound mirrored the exhaustion of the basement. Wolves in human form sat slumped against the concrete barricades. The defenders lacked their usual sharp focus. The moon hangover stripped their reflexes, turning the elite apex predators into sluggish targets. Every person who promises protection eventually leaves. The familiar, bitter thought crept into the back of my mind. I stood near the command center, watching Old Man Griff fumble with a wrench near a transport truck. The old mechanic dropped the tool twice. Hutch, the cheerful cook, leaned against the kitchen frame, his eyes half closed in a daze. The formidable Iron Claw pack looked like a stiff breeze could knock them into the dirt. My chest tightened. The warlord took a silver bullet for me. He proved his loyalty in blood, but the sight of the weakened pack triggered my deepest, most ingrained survival instinct. Trust gets people killed, my brain calculated, the old emotional wound flaring to life. A foundation must be solid. This pack is running on empty fuel lines. If Jax attacks today, the walls fall. I need an exit strategy. My exit strategy sat a half-mile away, hidden behind a crumbling concrete wall. My 1983 Ford Ranger pickup truck contained my emergency rations, spare parts, and a solid steel lockbox bolted under the driver's seat. That box held 10,000 salvage credits. The credits bought a green zone border pass. The pass guaranteed a life free from feral gang wars. I needed to secure the truck and drive it inside the compound gates. I glanced toward the penthouse stairs. Ronan needed sleep. Asking him for an escort meant dragging a feverish, depleted man into the wasteland. Asking Beta Bram meant pulling a sluggish guard away from a vulnerable perimeter. My hyper-independence took the wheel. I survived 5 years in the Barrens alone. I did not need permission to retrieve my own property. I slipped away from the command center, my boots making zero noise against the gravel. I kept Ronan's heavy leather duster wrapped around my shoulders, the scent of campfire smoke and crushed pine offering a strange, contradictory comfort to my reckless plan. I bypassed the motor pool and headed for the ruined east gate. The mechanics managed to stack a few rusted shipping crates across the gap, but a narrow opening remained. Squeezing my petite frame through the jagged metal, I left the fortified sanctuary behind. The morning air felt crisp and biting. The sun climbed higher, casting long, harsh shadows across the desolate landscape. I hiked across the uneven dirt, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The wasteland remained still, no roaring engines, no howling wolves. I hiked for 20 minutes, the physical exertion warming my muscles. The outline of the crumbling concrete wall appeared in the distance. The familiar rust-orange roof of my Ford Ranger peeked over the top of the barrier. Relief flooded my chest. The vehicle sat untouched, right where I left it during the tire heist. I approached the driver's side door, the scent of motor oil and old rust cutting through the desert air. This vehicle served as my home, my workshop, and my sanctuary. It lacked the military-grade plating of the warlord's Charger, but it possessed a soul forged in stubborn survival. I reached for the metal door handle, oblivious to the fact that my refusal to ask for help just placed me in the exact center of a lethal trap. Chapter 14. I pulled the rusted door of the Ford Ranger open. The metal hinges shrieked, a familiar, comforting sound that grounded my scattered nerves. I climbed into the cramped cab, sinking into the frayed fabric of the driver's seat. The interior smelled of stale coffee, motor oil, and old rust. This space represented the only consistent safety I knew since childhood. I ran my gloved hand over the cracked dashboard. I tapped the broken radio dial. I reached toward the passenger seat, my fingers brushing against a heavy steel wrench resting on the faded upholstery. My father handed me that exact wrench on my 10th birthday. He taught me the anatomy of an engine block under the scorching desert sun. He promised the settlement walls would keep the raiders out. He promised we would build a permanent garage. The raiders breached the walls 2 weeks later. The leaders of the settlement traded our coordinates for a shipment of purified water, selling us out to save their own hides. Tools tell the truth, I thought, gripping the cold steel handle. A wrench turns a bolt or it strips the thread. It delivers honest results. People manufacture false hope. I tossed the wrench onto the passenger floorboard. Reaching under my own seat, my fingers brushed the cold, solid metal of the lockbox bolted to the floor pan. I let out a jagged sigh of relief. The 10,000 salvage credits remained secure. My ticket to the green zone sat waiting. I inserted my key into the ignition. I twisted the metal forward. The engine let out a harsh, grinding sputter. The starter motor clicked, failing to turn the crankshaft. I frowned, trying the key a second time. The engine refused to catch. A shadow fell across the cracked windshield, blocking the morning sunlight. I snapped my head up. A gaunt, tattooed figure stood on the hood of my truck. Alpha Jax, the feral leader of the Sandskull Rogues, loomed over the glass. He wore a shredded canvas vest, his wiry frame covered in jagged ink. He carried a foul, oppressive wasteland stench, polluting the clean air of my sanctuary. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped the key, reaching for the heavy steel wrench on the floorboard. Jax did not draw a blade. He did not level a salvaged shotgun at my chest. A cruel, calculated smirk stretched across his dirt-stained face. He held a thick, crude pipe bomb in his right hand. A bright orange fuse sputtered near the metal cap, burning down toward the volatile powder inside. He did not want my salvage. He wanted to eradicate my foundation. The rogue leader tossed the explosive device into the open bed of the rust-orange pickup truck. The heavy metal pipe hit the rusted floor pan with a definitive, hollow clang. I did not waste a fraction of a second trying to save the credits. I did not reach for the lockbox. Survival demanded immediate, violent action. I threw my body backward, tumbling out of the open driver's side door. I hit the freezing sand, rolling my frame into a tight ball. I clamped my leather-gloved hands over the back of my neck, pressing my face into the dirt. The blast shattered the morning quiet. A shockwave of heat and concussive force ripped over my head. The explosion tore the sputtering truck to pieces. Shards of jagged metal, burning rubber, and melted plastic rained down across the desert floor. The concussive blast rattled my teeth. A high-pitched, agonizing ring pierced my eardrums, drowning out the sound of falling debris. A wave of black smoke washed over my position. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, spitting the grit from my mouth. The bitter taste of burnt fuel coated my tongue. I turned my head, staring at the crater. The Ford Ranger was gone. A twisted, burning carcass of blackened steel sat in its place. The cab looked unrecognizable. The seats burned. The lockbox holding my life savings vaporized in the localized inferno. My emergency rations, my spare parts, and my father's heavy steel wrench turned to useless ash. My retirement fund, my escape plan, my ticket to the green zone, the explosion consumed all of it in a single devastating heartbeat. I stared at the flames. My throat tightened. The witty, sarcastic remarks I used to deflect trauma vanished. The snark dried up, leaving a hollow, crushing void in my chest. I did not make a joke about the poor gas mileage. I did not offer a cynical observation about wasteland depreciation. I broke. Pure, silent grief anchored me to the dirt. The last physical piece of my father ceased to exist. The illusion of my hyper-independent escape plan burned to a crisp. I possessed nothing but the oversized leather duster draped over my shoulders. Heavy, scuffed boots stepped into my field of vision. I tilted my head up, my expression blank and numb. Alpha Jax stood inches away, unbothered by the roaring fire behind him.
The Ironclaw Alpha values you,
Jax observed, his voice a raspy, grating sneer.
He shielded you during the dust storm. He keeps you in his inner sanctum. That makes you valuable salvage.
I did not scramble backward. I did not fight. The explosion drained the fight from my bones. Jax lunged forward, his wiry fingers clamped around the thick collar of the leather duster. He hoisted me off the ground, lifting my boots clear of the dirt. He hauled my limp form away from the burning wreckage of the truck, dragging me toward a rusted transport vehicle idling near the ridge. The Sandskull leader threw me into the metal cargo bed. I hit the rusted floorboards, my gaze fixed on the rising plume of black smoke. The mechanic lost her garage, leaving her at the mercy of a monster who loved to break things. Chapter 15. The rusted transport vehicle bounced over the jagged craters of the dust barrens, rattling my bones with every brutal impact. Two scarred rogues stood guard over my captive form in the metal cargo bed, their rusted weapons drawn. The drive lasted an agonizing hour. The desert wind whipped through the open cab, but the loss of my truck burned hotter than any chill. The transport slammed to a halt inside the Sandskull camp. The rogue territory lacked the fortified, organized structure of the Ironclaw compound. Tattered canvas tarps flapped in the wind, strung between bent metal spikes and gutted vehicle chassis. The ground lay littered with discarded bones and empty fuel cans. A pair of rough hands grabbed my shoulders, dragging me out of the cargo bed. The guards hauled me into the center of the largest, filthiest tent in the camp. The stench of rotting flesh and stale grime hung thick in the enclosed space. Jax kicked a wooden chair into the dirt. He forced me down onto the splintered seat, retrieving a coil of frayed, stiff rope from a nearby crate. The feral leader worked with hurried, erratic motions, binding my wrists to the wooden arms of the chair. He wrapped the rough fibers around my chest, securing my torso to the backrest. I sat in the chair, my face devoid of emotion. The snarky mechanic who critiqued bad knot-tying remained buried under the ashes of the Ford Ranger. I stared at the dirt floor, the silence stretching between us. Jack stepped back, puffing out his tattooed chest. He wanted to establish dominance. He needed the hostage to grovel, securing his ego before the inevitable ransom negotiation with the Iron Claw pack. He expected tears. He expected a frantic, desperate plea for mercy. Finding a blank, unresponsive captive frustrated his primal instincts. The rogue leader pulled up a second wooden chair. He sat down backward, crossing his wiry arms over the backrest. He leaned close to my face, his dark eyes analyzing my shattered demeanor. He did not yell. He did not shout a booming alpha command to force my submission. Instead, Jax attacked my core lie with calm, chilling honesty.
You mourn the rusted truck.
Jax stated, his raspy voice scraping the quiet air.
You mourn the illusion of escape. The green zone is a fantasy, gearhead. A lie built to keep the drifters turning wrenches.
I did not respond. I kept my gaze locked on the dirt.
You thought the Iron Claw walls provided safety.
The rogue continued, his tone carrying a venomous, measured cadence.
You trusted the Mountain King. You thought his military bunker and his steel doors meant survival. But you sit tied to my chair. Where is your fierce protector now?
He is recovering from a silver bullet he took for me. My brain provided the logical defense, but the emotional wound bled too fast to vocalize the thought.
The settlements lied.
Jax whispered, leaning an inch closer.
They promised your people food and water, then sold you to the highest bidder. The military lied. They built bunkers and abandoned the citizens to the dust.
He tilted his head, delivering the final, devastating blow.
Your father lied when he said you would be safe.
Jax declared, watching my eyes for a flinch.
He handed you a wrench and told you to fix the broken pieces. But the world is meant to break. Trust is a weakness. I am the only honest man left in the Barrens. I promise destruction, and I deliver it.
My throat tightened. The villain dissected my soul with surgical precision. He weaponized my deepest trauma, validating the hyper-independent flaw that isolated me from the world. Trust gets people killed. Jax proved the rule. A faint, rhythmic rattling noise echoed near the entrance of the tent. Jax ignored the sound, assuming a guard shifted their footing outside the canvas flap. He kept his chilling gaze locked on my face, waiting for my spirit to snap. The bottom edge of the tattered canvas lifted. A fat, scarred, armor-plated mutant armadillo squeezed under the fabric. Scrap navigated the dirt floor with singular purpose. The grumpy pet tracked my scent across miles of desolate wasteland. He bypassed the guards, slipping through the disorganized camp undetected. The beast waddled into the dim light of the tent. He ignored the gaunt, tattooed warlord sitting in the chair. Scrap lumbered right up to my left boot. He let out a soft, clicking hiss, pressing his leathery snout against my shin. Jax blinked in confusion, staring down at the mutant trespasser. I looked at the armadillo. I did not possess a red canvas backpack. I did not hold a tin of syrupy peaches. I offered 0 caloric bribes. Scrap did not care. The transactional relationship evolved. The grumpy, armor-plated tank opened his tiny mouth and clamped his sharp front teeth right over the thick, frayed rope binding my left wrist to the wooden armrest. He gnawed the fibers with frantic, selfless energy. He came for me. The realization pierced the heavy, suffocating gloom in my chest. He expects 0 reward. He just wants his mechanic back. The tiny act of pure, unprompted loyalty shattered Jax's chilling philosophy. The world contained destruction, but it also harbored stubborn, relentless connection. Trust carried risks, but isolation guaranteed a slow death.
Get away from the hostage, you mutated rat.
Jax yelled, kicking his boot toward the armadillo. Scrap executed a flawless tripwire maneuver, rolling his heavy shell directly into the path of the incoming boot. Jax struck the solid armor plate, letting out a sharp curse as pain flared up his shin. The distraction provided the exact margin of error I needed. The rope binding my left wrist frayed and snapped under the armadillo's teeth. My arm sprang free. I possessed one loose hand, a loyal mutant sidekick, and a sudden, burning desire to prove the Sandskull leader wrong. Chapter 16. I flexed my newly freed left hand, ripping the remaining frayed fibers away from the wooden armrest of the interrogation chair. The circulation rushed back into my stiff knuckles, bringing a harsh, stinging burn. Alpha Jax turned his attention away from the canvas entrance. His dark eyes narrowed, catching the subtle movement of my loose wrist. A broken restraint offers a narrow window of opportunity, my brain calculated, pushing past the crushing grief of my destroyed truck. You must widen the gap. Jax opened his mouth, preparing to shout a command to his exterior guards. The words died in his throat. A deafening, mechanical roar eclipsed all other sound in the Sandskull camp. The ground beneath our boots trembled. The tattered canvas walls of the interrogation tent exploded inward. A heavy, custom-built transport truck plowed right through the center of the rogue territory, shattering the bent metal spikes and shredding the fabric tarps. The Iron Claw pack arrived. The transport slammed to a halt, kicking up a thick wall of choking dirt. Before the dust could settle, a sleek, black 1970 Dodge Charger breached the perimeter from the opposite flank. The armored vehicle smashed through a barricade of rusted fuel barrels. The heavy pre-war drop steel crumpled the enemy defenses with effortless, industrial force. Jack stumbled backward, drawing a jagged combat knife from his belt. I did not wait for an invitation. I ripped my right arm against the remaining ropes, using the leverage of my free hand to loosen the crude knots. The fibers slipped. My right wrist pulled free. I shoved myself out of the wooden chair, scooping the 40-pound armadillo into my arms.
You do not get to leave, gearhead.
Jack snarled, lunging across the dirt floor. The feral leader clamped his wiry hand around the thick collar of the leather duster I wore. He yanked me backward. My combat boots slipped on the loose earth. Scrap hissed, thrashing in my grip, but the rogue alpha ignored the mutant pet. Jax dragged me out of the ruined tent and into the chaotic, sprawling battlefield of the camp. The Iron Claw defenders swarmed the rogue territory. Wolves in human form clashed with the Sandskull fighters, wielding salvaged blades and heavy iron pipes. The metallic clash of weapons rang through the desert air. Jax hauled me toward the center of the compound. He needed leverage. He needed a hostage to halt the slaughter of his outmatched gang.
Hold your ground.
Jax screamed, pressing the edge of his rusted blade against my throat.
Stand down, or the mechanic bleeds.
The fighting in our immediate vicinity ground to a halt. The Iron Claw wolves lowered their weapons, recognizing my face. They parted ranks, creating a wide circle of open dirt. A towering figure stepped out from the dust cloud. Alpha Ronin marched into the center of the ring. He wore his dark gray tank top, exposing the thick white bandages wrapped tight around his ribs. The silver rot took a severe toll on his stamina, but sheer, unfiltered rage fueled his current steps. His intense gaze locked onto Jax. The Mountain King projected a lethal, suffocating aura that pushed the freezing desert chill away.
Release her,
Ronin ordered. The gravelly command carried zero room for negotiation.
You brought your entire pack for a single human.
Jax mocked, tightening his grip on my collar.
You grew soft, warlord. You built a foundation on a fragile anchor. The world is meant to break. I proved it this morning.
My stomach dropped into the dirt. The memory of my rust-orange Ford Ranger blowing to ashes flashed behind my eyes. My life savings vaporized. My father's legacy turned to scrap. The crushing void in my chest flared, swallowing any lingering urge to offer a sarcastic quip. I remained silent, staring at the scarred warlord standing 10 feet away. He took a silver bullet for you, a quiet voice echoed in my head. He brought an army to find you. A heavy, metallic clatter drew my attention. During the chaotic breach, the armored Dodge Charger crushed a stack of surplus fuel canisters. A steady stream of raw gasoline poured from the cracked metal, pooling in a wide, shimmering puddle across the dirt, stopping just inches from Jax's boots. The scent of harsh chemical fuel overpowered the stench of the rogue camp. I glanced past Ronin's broad shoulder. The heavy transport truck sat parked near the ruins of the main gate. The rear canvas flap hung open. A small, dirt-smudged face peeked out from the cargo bed. Liam. The 10-year-old orphan snuck aboard the convoy, refusing to stay behind in the underground bunker. The boy held a long, heavy steel wrench in his right hand. He retrieved the tool from the Iron Claw motor pool. Liam made direct eye contact with me. A good mechanic never looks away from the engine. I recalled the lesson from the garage. It requires timing and trust. Liam stepped to the edge of the cargo bed. He did not hesitate. He did not aim. The boy lobbed the heavy steel wrench high into the air, executing a flawless, sweeping arc over the heads of the surrounding pack members. I did not track the flight path of the metal. I trusted the trajectory. I dropped the armadillo. Scrap hit the dirt and scurried away. I reached my right hand up, opening my leather-gloved palm without taking my eyes off the rogue leader holding the blade to my throat. The heavy steel handle slapped right into my grip. Jax blinked, his mind struggling to process the sudden appearance of the weapon. I gripped the wrench tight. I twisted my torso, driving the blunt steel head upward. The metal connected with the underside of Jax's jaw with a brutal, bone-jarring crack. The rogue leader shrieked, his grip faltering. He stumbled backward, dropping the combat knife to clutch his shattered jaw. He stepped directly into the center of the shimmering gasoline puddle. I reached into the pocket of my jumpsuit with my left hand. My fingers brushed the familiar, rough texture of my wooden matchbox. I pulled a single strike-anywhere match from the cardboard sleeve. "The world breaks," I stated, my voice flat and hollow, stripped of all humor. "But fire cleans up the mess." I flicked my thumbnail against the sulfur tip. The chemical coating sparked, flaring into a bright, hot blue flame. I did not hesitate. I tossed the burning stick straight onto the soaked earth. The gasoline ignited with a ferocious, roaring whoosh. A 10-foot wall of blistering orange fire erupted between me and the Sand Skull leader, illuminating the grim faces of the Iron Claw pack and trapping the villain in a cage of his own making. Chapter 17. The wall of fire roared toward the bruised sky, casting wild, dancing shadows across the Sand Skull camp. The intense heat blistered the exposed skin on my face. Alpha Jax shrieked, scrambling backward to escape the towering flames. His boots slipped in the loose dirt. He fell hard, crawling away from the inferno. The feral leader lost his weapon, his hostage, and his control over the battlefield in a single, devastating sequence. I stood near the edge of the blaze, the heavy steel wrench hanging loose in my grip. The crushing numbness in my chest remained. The destruction of my rust-orange pickup truck left a permanent, gaping hole in my foundation, but a spark of cold satisfaction settled over the ash. I leveled the playing field. A blurred shape launched over the burning gasoline. Alpha Ronin did not walk around the fire. The Mountain King cleared the 10-foot inferno in a single, desperate leap. The warlord shifted mid-air. The transformation defied the agonizing limitations of his silver wound. His spine bowed, the bones snapping and reshaping with brutal speed. The dark gray tank top shredded into useless strips of fabric. The thick white bandages tore away, exposing the angry, inflamed scar tissue on his ribs. He ignored the biological toll, driven by a raw, untamed instinct to eradicate the threat to his mate. A giant black wolf crashed into the dirt on the opposite side of the flames. Jack scrambled to his feet, turning to run. He did not make it 2 steps. The black wolf lunged, his heavy paws striking the rogue's shoulders. The impact drove Jax into the earth with bone-crushing force. The beast clamped his heavy jaws around the rogue leader's right wrist, locking his teeth over the joint. The wolf bit down. A sharp, sickening snap echoed over the crackle of the fire. Jax let out a final, broken wail before passing out from the sheer, overwhelming agony. The Sand Skull fighters witnessed the brutal defeat of their invincible leader. The remaining rogues dropped their salvaged iron pipes and rusted machetes. Some fell to their knees in surrender. The rest turned and sprinted into the vast, howling expanse of the Dust Barrens, choosing the lethal elements over the wrath of the Iron Claw pack. The skirmish ended. Beta Bram stepped forward, signaling the defenders to secure the prisoners. The Iron Claw wolves moved with swift, ruthless efficiency, binding the surrendered rogues with heavy zip ties and confiscating their makeshift weapons. I bypassed the chaotic cleanup, walking around the dying edge of the gasoline fire. The giant black wolf stood over the unconscious rogue. The beast breathed in harsh, ragged gasps. The adrenaline of the battle faded, allowing the lingering pain of the silver rot to reclaim his nervous system. His thick midnight fur bristled. He looked up, his sharp focus tracking my approach. The wolf dropped his head, initiating the agonizing reverse shift. The sound of realigning bones filled the quiet space. Seconds later, Ronan knelt in the dirt in his human form. Sweat poured down his face. The angry red scar on his ribs pulsed, a stark reminder of the bullet he took to ensure my survival. He stared up at me from the dirt. He searched my features for any sign of physical injury. He looked at the frayed ropes hanging from my wrists, the soot staining my cheeks, and the heavy duster swallowing my frame. He tore his own body apart to cross the fire. I registered, my grip tightening on the steel wrench. He risked a permanent injury just to reach this spot. I stopped 2 feet away from the kneeling warlord. I did not drop the tool. I did not offer a tearful embrace. The emotional wreckage of the morning left me hollow, incapable of processing the magnitude of his rescue. "You took your sweet time," I stated, my voice flat and stripped of sarcasm. Ronan let out a harsh, exhausted exhale. He did not reprimand my lack of gratitude. He recognized the heavy, silent grief anchoring my boots to the ground. The warlord understood the devastation of losing a foundation.
The Charger suffered a flat tire.
Ronan replied, his gravelly tone gentle.
It delayed our departure.
I stared at him, a tiny, fractured sliver of respect breaking through the numbness. He offered a mechanical excuse to comfort a grieving mechanic.
"Ivy!"
A young voice shouted across the camp. I turned my head. Liam jogged toward our position, dodging the surrendered rogues. The 10-year-old orphan stopped next to the warlord, his chest heaving. The boy looked from the heavy wrench in my hand to the unconscious villain in the dirt. "That was a perfect throw, Liam," I praised, forcing a steady cadence into my words. "Your timing was flawless." Liam beamed, the sheer pride erasing the fear from his dirt-smudged face. He proved his worth in the Wasteland. He belonged to a crew. Scrap waddled out from beneath a rusted chassis, rejoining our group. The armadillo clicked his teeth, bumping his armored shell against my shin. The mutant pet secured his place as a permanent, loyal sidekick.
Load the transport,
Ronan ordered, pushing himself up from the ground. He swayed, the feverish exhaustion catching up to his muscles. He braced his hand against his ribs.
We returned to the compound.
I did not argue. I followed the warlord toward the black Dodge Charger parked near the edge of the ruins. I slid into the passenger seat, pulling the heavy door shut. The thick, pre-war military plating isolated us from the noise of the cleanup. The drive back to the Iron Claw territory passed in total silence. I stared out the reinforced glass, watching the desolate, barren landscape blur past. I possessed 0 salvage credits. I owned 0 vehicles. My entire net worth consisted of a stolen leather coat, a wooden matchbox, and a steel lug wrench. The physical elements of my life vanished, leaving only a terrifying, unfamiliar path forward. Chapter 18. The Iron Claw compound offered a quiet, insulated sanctuary from the biting desert wind. The pack returned victorious, securing the gates and standing down from the high-alert protocols. I sat on the edge of the sprawling, fur-lined mattress in the penthouse. I placed the heavy steel wrench on the floorboards. The adrenaline faded, leaving my limbs heavy and uncoordinated. I stared at the rusted metal walls, trying to calculate my next logical step. A vehicle without an engine block serves no purpose. My internal monologue offered a grim assessment. You are stranded in a warlord's territory with 0 assets. The heavy steel door clicked open. Alpha Ronan stepped into the room. He wore a fresh gray thermal shirt, hiding the silver scar on his ribs. The warlord moved with a slow, measured caution, respecting the quiet grief polluting the air. He walked over to the small table in the corner. He poured a cup of bitter black coffee from a dented metal thermos. He did not offer me a cup, knowing my aversion to the terrible brew. He took a sip, leaning his broad back against the wall.
Your truck is gone,
Ronan stated, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. The Sandskull leader utilized a pipe bomb, I replied, keeping my gaze locked on the floorboards. The blast vaporized the chassis. It destroyed my lockbox. My 10,000 salvage credits turned to ash. Ronan set the tin cup down. He crossed his arms over his broad chest.
You intended to buy a green zone border pass. You intended to leave the Barrens.
I intended to find a permanent garage, I corrected, a bitter edge entering my tone. I intended to build a life free from feral gang wars and collapsing infrastructure. Now, I possess nothing.
You possess the pack.
The alpha countered, pushing off the wall. He took 2 steps toward the mattress, stopping to maintain a respectful distance.
You possess a place within these walls.
I looked up. The fierce amber intensity in his eyes burned through the dim light of the penthouse. He did not project the terrifying, dominating aura of a ruthless warlord. He projected the desperate, vulnerable hope of a man offering his entire foundation to a stranger.
The beast inside my mind recognized you the moment you stole my spare tire.
Ronan confessed, bearing the truth of shifter biology.
The lunar shift confirmed the instinct. The pack doctor calls it a biological imperative. The wolves call it a mate bond.
My ribs contracted. A cold vice clamped around my lungs, restricting my oxygen.
The bond is permanent.
Ronan explained, his words heavy and deliberate.
It cannot be broken by distance or time. It demands proximity. It demands protection. I tore my body apart to cross that fire today, because my soul requires you to breathe.
He offered an anchor. He offered a forever home, protected by heavy iron gates and a loyal army. Depending on a predator only guarantees a broken heart. The bitter defense mechanism screamed in my head, drowning out the steady beat of his heart. My father built a life in a fortified settlement. He trusted the guards. He trusted the leaders. When the raiders arrived, the people he trusted traded his life for a barrel of water. A permanent bond meant placing my entire survival into the hands of another fallible, breakable human. If the Iron Claw compound fell, if Ronan took a bullet to the chest instead of the ribs, the resulting devastation would destroy me. No, I whispered, the words scraping out of my dry throat. Ronan flinched. The rejection hit him harder than the silver shotgun slug.
Ivy.
No, I repeated, standing up from the mattress. My hands shook. I grabbed my red canvas backpack from the floor. The people who swear to protect you are always the first to let you burn. A warlord draws enemies. A pack invites war. I cannot tie my life to a target. I unzipped the main compartment. I shoved my spare thermal shirt inside. I grabbed my wooden matchbox and tossed it into the bag. I picked up the heavy steel wrench, sliding the cold metal into the side pocket.
You are grieving the loss of your independence,
Ronan stated, keeping his voice painfully calm. He did not step forward to block my path.
You are running from a ghost.
I am surviving the wasteland, I corrected, zipping the canvas bag shut. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder. I charge 50 salvage credits an hour for mechanical repairs. I fixed your generator. We are even. I walked toward the heavy steel door. I expected the warlord to issue a booming command. I expected him to throw me over his shoulder and lock me in the bunker. The beast inside his mind demanded possession. Ronan did not move. He stood in the center of the room, his broad shoulders tight with suppressed agony.
The wolf demands I drag her back inside and bolt the iron gates.
Ronan's internal struggle reached a brutal conclusion.
But chaining an anchor only shatters the steel.
The gates are open,
Ronan said, his voice cracking under the weight of his own restraint. He chose my freedom over his own biological need. He let me go. I did not look back. I stepped out of the penthouse, descending the winding iron staircase. I walked across the quiet courtyard, bypassing the motor pool and the children's bunker. I reached the front of the compound. The heavy iron gates stood ajar. I walked out into the freezing, desolate expanse of the dust barrens. The wind howled against my stolen leather duster, carrying the bitter sting of the dust. I secured my freedom, but the victory tasted like ash. Chapter 19. The morning wind offered zero shelter as I marched further away from the compound. I placed one duct-taped combat boot in front of the other, the crunch of gravel echoing in the quiet, desolate landscape. I did not look over my shoulder. Fleeing a fortified sanctuary makes zero tactical sense, my brain calculated, fighting the stubborn rhythm of my marching boots. You own no vehicle. You possess 0 salvage credits. Surviving out here requires resources you lack. I pulled the oversized collar of Ronan's leather duster up around my neck. The thick hide blocked the freezing wind, trapping my body heat inside the coat. The thick hide carried the distinct, lingering warmth of the alpha. Every time I pulled the collar tight, the heat reminded me of the warlord I just abandoned. He let me walk away. He suppressed his feral instincts, choosing my freedom over his own biological need. A rhythmic, clacking noise echoed off the rocks behind me. I stopped walking. I turned around, dropping my hand to the steel wrench resting in the side pocket of my red canvas backpack. Scrap the mutant armadillo waddled over the crest of a small dirt ridge. The 40-pound beast navigated the treacherous terrain with single-minded determination. His scarred armor plates rattled with every step. He ignored the safety of the Ironclaw motor pool, choosing to follow the exiled mechanic into the wasteland. "You are going the wrong way, Scrap," I stated, pointing a gloved finger back toward the distant compound. "Hutch has roasted game in the kitchen. I have nothing but a half-empty tin of peaches and a bad attitude." The armadillo ignored my logic. He closed the distance, stopping right at the toe of my combat boot. He let out a grumpy, clicking hiss, demanding we continue the journey. My throat tightened. The mutant pet refused to abandon his chosen anchor. "Suit yourself," I muttered, turning back toward the horizon, "but do not complain when we have to sleep in the dirt." We hiked for another grueling hour. The sun climbed higher, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over the cracked earth. My leg muscles burned with the exertion, demanding rest. I ignored the fatigue, pushing forward until the familiar outline of a crumbling concrete wall appeared in the distance. I reached the site of the ambush. The crater sat in the center of the road, marked by a wide circle of scorched earth. I stopped at the edge of the blast radius. My 1983 Ford Ranger pickup truck no longer existed. The explosive force of the rogue's pipe bomb tore the vehicle apart, leaving behind a twisted, blackened carcass of warped steel. I sank into the dirt, my mechanic instincts taking over to conduct a grim final inspection on the wreckage. The intense heat melted the engine block into a useless lump of slag. The fiberglass hood shattered into 1,000 jagged splinters. I reached out, my thick leather glove brushing against the remains of the front left tire. The puncture-proof rubber turned into a sticky, hardened puddle of sludge. The drive shaft snapped in half, the jagged metal ends pointing toward the bruised sky. I crawled toward the center of the debris field. I pushed aside a piece of warped sheet metal, searching the area beneath the melted driver's seat. The heavy steel lockbox containing my 10,000 salvage credits sat blown wide open. The lid tore clean off the hinges. The intense fire incinerated the paper credits, leaving nothing but a thick layer of gray ash coating the floor pan. My retirement fund vanished. My ticket to the green zone burned away in a fraction of a second. I sifted my fingers through the ash, searching for a miracle. I looked for the familiar shape of my father's steel wrench, the tool he handed me on my 10th birthday. The blast shattered the metal, scattering the broken pieces into the desert wind. I found nothing. A mechanic without a garage is just a drifter waiting to die. The hollow realization settled deep in my chest. I sat in the dirt, crossing my legs. The quiet devastation anchored my body to the ground. My hyper-independent escape plan proved to be a fragile illusion. I spent 5 years preparing to leave the Barrens, hoarding credits and trusting no one. In the end, the isolation did not protect me. The isolation left me sitting in a pile of ashes, staring at a melted engine block. Scrap waddled over to my side. The mutant armadillo nudged his leathery snout against my knee, offering a quiet, unspoken comfort. I needed a distraction. I needed a sharp burst of sugar to clear the fog in my head. I pulled my red canvas backpack off my shoulders, setting the bag in my lap. I unzipped the main compartment, reaching inside to find the final tin of syrupy peaches. My fingers brushed against something hard and wooden. I frowned. I did not pack any wood. I wrapped my hand around the object and pulled it out into the glaring sunlight. I stared at the small block of carved pine. The wood featured 4 tiny sanded wheels, a smooth cab, and a miniature truck bed. It was the wooden toy truck Ronan carved by the fire in Chapter 5. The fearsome warlord spent his midnight hours crafting the object for the pack orphans. How did this get into my bag? I turned the toy over in my hands. A memory flashed in my mind. During the chaotic battle at the Sandskull camp, Liam snuck into the transport truck. The 10-year-old boy tossed me the heavy steel wrench that saved my life. Before the skirmish, Liam spent hours shadowing me in the motor pool. He had ample opportunity to slip the carved toy into the main compartment of my backpack. The boy wanted me to carry a piece of the compound with me. He wanted me to remember the Iron Claw pack. I traced my thumb over the smooth, sanded roof of the wooden cab. The craftsmanship required patience, steady hands, and a quiet, hidden softness. Ronan built the toy to bring joy to a child who lost everything. He built a foundation for his people, fortifying the walls and taking bullets to keep them breathing. Running prevents the betrayal, but it also guarantees a lonely end, I thought, a sudden, sharp clarity piercing the numbness in my chest. My father did not hand me a wrench so I could run away. He taught me the anatomy of an engine so I could fix broken things. I spent 5 years running from ghosts, terrified of laying down roots. But a vehicle requires maintenance, and a home requires an anchor. I looked at the twisted ashes of the Ford Ranger. The past burned away. I looked at the carved wooden toy in my hand. The future offered a permanent garage. I shoved the toy back into my canvas bag. I zipped the compartment shut and slung the heavy strap over my shoulder. I stood up, brushing the dirt from the knees of my jumpsuit. "Come on, Scrap," I instructed, turning my back on the crater. "We are going home." Chapter 20. The trek back to the Iron Claw compound took less time than the departure. A newfound driving purpose fueled my steps, pushing the fatigue out of my burning muscles. The midday sun beat down on the leather duster, but I refused to take the coat off. The heavy hide served as a shield against the wasteland. I reached the front perimeter. The towering iron gate stood shut, secured against the dangers of the barrens. I walked up to the fortified entrance. A perimeter guard stood in the rusted watchtower above. He leaned over the railing, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized my grease-stained face. He expected the exiled human to perish in the desert. He did not expect her to march right back to the front door. "Open the gate," I demanded, crossing my arms over my chest. The guard scrambled down the metal ladder. The heavy gears ground together with a loud, shrieking protest. The iron doors parted just enough to let me slip through the gap. Scrap waddled right past my boots, thrilled to return to a location with a steady food supply. I ignored the stunned stares of the courtyard defenders. I marched straight toward the western wall, keeping my focus locked on the open bay doors of the motor pool. The garage buzzed with frantic energy. Old Man Griff yelled instructions at a pair of junior mechanics. Hutch unloaded crates of salvaged parts near the back wall. Liam sat on his familiar stack of bald tires, polishing a socket wrench with a dirty rag. The 10-year-old boy looked up. He dropped the rag. A giant, gap-toothed grin broke across his dirt-smudged face. He knew the wooden toy trick worked. Alpha Ronan stood in the center of the workspace. The warlord looked terrible. The silver rot and the subsequent lunar shift drained the color from his rugged features. Dark bruises shadowed the skin under his sharp, predatory eyes. He wore a clean gray thermal shirt, but his broad shoulders held a rigid, unnatural tension. He supervised the repairs, forcing his broken body to perform its duties. He heard my boots hit the concrete floor. Ronan turned around. He froze. The ruler of the Dust Barons stared at me, his chest heaving with a sudden, jagged breath. He did not speak. He did not ask why I returned. He simply let the raw, unfiltered relief wash over his scarred face. I walked across the garage, stopping 3 feet away from his boots. "Your mechanics are sloppy," I stated, breaking the silence with a brisk, professional critique. "Griff is using the wrong grade of oil for the perimeter generators. The engines will seize by midnight if I do not overhaul the system." A slow, devastating smirk tugged at the corner of Ronan's mouth. He understood the language of the mechanic. I did not offer a sweeping, emotional declaration. I offered a lifelong repair contract.
"The motor pool requires a head specialist,"
Ronan replied, his gravelly voice dropping to a warm rumble.
"The position is vacant."
"I accept the job. I agreed, dropping my canvas backpack onto a nearby metal workbench. Ronan stepped closer, closing the distance between us. The blistering heat radiating from his skin soaked through my clothes, grounding my scattered nerves. He gestured toward the rear of the garage. A large object sat parked in the shadows, covered by a thick, heavy canvas tarp.
Come here,
The warlord instructed, leading the way. I followed him to the back of the motor pool. Ronan grabbed the edge of the canvas and yanked the heavy fabric away. The tarp slid to the floor, revealing the surprise underneath. I lost my breath. A custom-built, heavy-duty tactical truck sat on the concrete. The vehicle featured a rugged, reinforced suspension built to conquer the deep craters of the Barrens. Thick, pre-war drop steel armor plated the doors and the front grille. A heavy steel winch sat bolted to the bumper. The paint shone in a matte, utilitarian black, ready to endure the harshest storms.
the pack mechanics built the chassis.
Ronan explained, watching my shocked expression.
I secured the armor plating from the underground bunker. It requires a competent driver.
I stepped forward, running my gloved hand along the pristine steel fender. The craftsmanship was impeccable. The vehicle represented an impenetrable fortress on wheels. It offered shelter, speed, and raw power. "It is flawless," I whispered, tracing the weld lines. Ronan moved to stand beside me. He reached out, holding his broad, calloused hand between us. He closed his fingers into a loose fist, holding something small and solid.
I sent Beta Bram to the blast crater this morning.
Ronan stated, his voice quiet, meant only for my ears.
I ordered him to sift through the ashes before the wind scattered the debris. He found a single surviving piece of the wreckage.
The warlord opened his palm. Resting in the center of his scarred hand was a round metal sphere. It was my father's old gear knob. The intense heat of the pipe bomb scorched the surface, leaving dark burn marks across the steel. Ronan spent the morning scrubbing the worst of the slag away, restoring the polished shine to the metal. My throat closed tight. Tears stung the back of my eyes, blurring my vision. The truck explosion vaporized my past. Jax destroyed my foundation. But the Mountain King sent his second-in-command to dig through the dirt, just to salvage a single piece of my father's memory. Ronan did not need a dramatic speech to prove he understood my soul. He proved it with restored steel. I picked the gear knob out of his palm. The metal felt warm from his skin. I looked up at the warlord. The fear of betrayal, the hyper-independent armor I wore for 5 years, crumbled to dust. I found my anchor. I turned my attention back to the tactical truck. I crouched down, inspecting the heavy rubber treads on the front tires. A teasing grin broke across my face, the familiar spark of humor returning to my chest. "These are exceptional tires," I noted, tapping my boot against the rubber. "I could trade these 4 wheels for a lifetime supply of syrupy peaches. I might just steal them." Ronan leaned against the steel fender, crossing his broad arms over his chest. His intense focus shone warm and steady.
Go ahead,
Ronan said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble.
Steal all 4.
I stood up. I did not sling my red canvas backpack over my shoulder. I opened the heavy steel door of the tactical truck. The hinges swung wide without a single squeal of protest. I pulled the steel wrench Liam gave me from the side pocket of my bag and slipped the tool into the glove compartment. I placed my father's gear knob on the center console. For the first time in 5 years, I unpacked. The end. And that is the end of Ivy and Ronan's story. But just because the dust settles on City A, the romance does not have to stop. If you fell in love with the Iron Claw pack and the thrill of the Wasteland, I have so much more waiting for you. Head over to Patreon and search for Lena Pierce. By joining the membership, you get instant access to exclusive, uncut story transcripts, early audio releases, and bonus chapters you will not find anywhere else. Your support keeps these characters alive and brings these intense shifter stories to your ears. Thank you for being a part of this journey with me. Join the pack, and I will see you in the next story.